Far beyond the edge of the solar system, a small silver ship moved quietly through the dark. Its name was the Horizon, and it carried only one passenger who truly mattered. His name was Thomas Hale, and he was the man chosen to speak for all of Earth among the stars. Thomas sat by the window of his private cabin, watching the stars slide past like slow rain on glass. He was 52 years old, with gray hair at his temples and tired lines around his eyes. But his eyes themselves were calm and steady, the eyes of a man who had learned to listen more than he spoke. That single skill, the skill of listening, had made him Earth's best hope in a galaxy full of older, stronger, and often colder nations of stars. It had been only 15 years since humanity learned it was not alone in the universe. Thomas still remembered the day it happened. He had been a young diplomat then, working for a small office at the United Nations, mostly ignored by the people who mattered. Then, one quiet morning, a strange ship had entered Earth's orbit. It did not attack. It did not even move quickly. It simply waited, patient as a held breath, until humanity worked up the courage to answer. The ship belonged to a species called the Threll. They were tall and calm, with skin the color of a clear evening sky, and they had been watching human broadcasts for almost a century before they finally introduced themselves. When they came with an offer, not a threat. They told humanity about a wide alliance of worlds called the Galactic Council, a group of species who had agreed, after a terrible and ancient war, that peace was worth protecting. Humanity was young in the eyes of the galaxy, young and small, and very far behind in technology. Some species did not think Earth deserved a seat at the table at all, but the Threll had argued for humanity, gently and patiently, the way they seemed to do everything. And so, 3 years ago, Earth had been granted a place at the Council as an observer world, one small voice among many great ones. Thomas Hale had been chosen to be that voice. He had not asked for the honor. In truth, he had almost said no. But his wife, Sarah, had looked at him one evening in their kitchen, drying a plate with a dish towel, and said something he never forgot. "Someone has to go, Thomas. Wouldn't you rather it be someone who actually cares what happens to us?" He had gone. Now 15 years after first contact, and 3 years into his work as ambassador, Thomas was returning once again to Concord Station, the great meeting place of the Galactic Council. This time, the meeting was more important than any before it. The Council was preparing to vote on a matter that could decide the future of Earth, and possibly the future of a dozen smaller worlds besides. The matter was called the Halden Reach. The Halden Reach was a wide belt of stars and broken planets that sat between human space and the territory of a powerful empire known as the Vex. Deep inside the rocks and dust of the Reach lay something rare and precious, aether crystal, a strange blue mineral that could power engines fast enough to cross the stars in days instead of years. Without aether crystal, no ship could travel far. With enough of it, an empire could expand forever. Earth had discovered small deposits of aether crystal on the edge of its own solar system only 2 years ago. It was not much, but it was enough to make other species take notice, and it was enough to put Earth directly in the path of the Vex Empire, who had long claimed that all of the Halden Reach belonged to them alone. Thomas's job at this meeting was simple to say, and terribly hard to do. He had to convince the Council to protect the Reach as shared territory, open to all member worlds, rather than letting the Vex seize it by force. If he failed, Earth's small colonies near the Reach would be helpless. If he succeeded, he would be making a very dangerous enemy. He already had. His enemy's name was Dren, and he held the title of warlord among the Vex, a rank that meant something close to both general and prince. Thomas had met him twice before, in council chambers filled with careful, polite hostility. Dren was tall even for a Vex, with skin like hammered bronze and eyes the color of dying embers. He wore his military armor even to peaceful meetings, as if daring anyone to forget what his people were capable of. "Humans," Dren had said the last time they met, not even looking at Thomas directly, "are children who have wandered into a house full of adults, and now believe the house belongs to them." Thomas had only smiled and said that children grow up. He thought of that exchange now, watching the stars through his window, and felt something tighten in his chest. Not fear, exactly. He had made peace with fear a long time ago. It was more like the feeling before a storm, when the air goes still and heavy, and every animal in the field lifts its head at once. A soft chime interrupted his thoughts. His ship's small computer, whose voice he had long ago set to sound gentle and unhurried, spoke into the quiet cabin. "Ambassador Hale, we will reach Concord Station in 6 hours. Would you like your evening meal now, or would you prefer to finish your notes first?" "Notes first, Iris," Thomas said. "Thank you." He turned back to the desk built into the cabin wall and looked at the speech he had been writing for 3 weeks. It still did not feel finished. It probably never would. But there was something else on the desk that he looked at more often than the speech. It was a small photograph, printed on real paper the old-fashioned way, because Thomas liked to hold things in his hands. In the photograph, his wife Sarah stood laughing in their backyard on Earth, her arms around their 2 children. Emily, their daughter, was 15 years old in the picture, caught mid-laugh with her father's same steady eyes. Jack, their son, was 23, tall and serious even while smiling, already wearing the plain gray flight jacket of Earth's small defense fleet. Thomas touched the edge of the photograph gently, the way another man might touch a wound to see if it still hurt. He thought back to the morning he had left for this journey, only 4 days ago now, though it felt like a much longer time. The morning had been ordinary in every way that mattered, which was exactly why Thomas remembered it so clearly. Sarah had made coffee too strong, the way she always did when she was nervous, though she never called it nervous. She called it distracted. Emily had come downstairs, still half asleep, her school books under one arm, and complained that the toast was burnt, though she ate it anyway. It was the kind of morning that happened in 1,000 houses across Earth every single day, and Thomas had loved it fiercely, because he knew that in a few hours, he would be trading it for the cold quiet of deep space. Jack had been the last to arrive at the table, already in his training uniform, his boots freshly polished. He was a cadet pilot with Earth's defense fleet, a small and mostly ceremonial force that had never fought a real battle, because until now, Earth had never needed to. "You nervous, Dad?" Jack had asked, pouring himself coffee and making a face at how strong it was. "A little," Thomas admitted. "Dren will be there again." Jack's jaw had tightened at the name. He had grown up hearing about Warlord Dren the way children in earlier centuries might have heard about a distant, dangerous king. "You should let me come with you sometime. See what you're dealing with. You have your own battles to train for," Thomas said gently. "Mine are fought with words, not ships. That's the whole point, Jack. If I do my job well, you never have to do yours." Jack had said nothing to that, only looked down at his coffee. And Thomas had felt, not for the first time, a small worry about his son's quiet anger. Jack had always been like that, even as a boy, calm and controlled on the surface, like still water over a strong current. Thomas sometimes wondered what would happen if that current ever broke free. After breakfast, when Sarah had gone to find her coat and Emily had run back upstairs for a forgotten book, Thomas had found himself alone with Jack in the hallway for just a moment. "I have something for you," Thomas said, and reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out an old pocket watch, its silver case scratched and worn smooth with age. It had belonged to Thomas's own father, and to his father before that. It did not tell time especially well anymore, but it had always felt, to Thomas, like it carried something more important than time. "Dad, I can't take that. It's yours." "It was my father's before it was mine," Thomas said, pressing it into Jack's hand and folding his son's fingers around it. "And someday, it will be yours anyway. I would just rather give it to you now, while I can still see your face when you take it." Jack had turned the watch over in his palm, feeling its familiar weight. "What's it for?" "Nothing really," Thomas said, smiling. "It doesn't keep very good time. But when things get difficult, and they will, I want you to hold it and remember that patience outlasts anger every single time. That's the only lesson worth passing down, as far as I can tell." Jack had nodded, though Thomas could see he did not fully understand yet. That was all right. Understanding, Thomas believed, often arrived late, sometimes only after the moment that needed it most had already passed. Sarah had driven him to the shuttle port herself, with Emily in the back seat quietly reading, and Jack following behind in his own car, because he had training that afternoon, and could not stay to see the ship leave. At the port, Sarah had held Thomas's face in both her hands, the way she always did, and said the same thing she said every single time he left. "Come home to us." "Always," Thomas had answered, though even as he said it, some small and honest part of him understood that a diplomat's promise, unlike a lover's, was not always his to keep. That same afternoon, while the Horizon carried his father out past the orbit of Mars, Jack Hale stood on the packed dirt of the Earth Defense Fleet training yard, sweat cooling on the back of his neck, and tried very hard not to think about any of it. "You're distracted," said a voice beside him, and Jack turned to see Alex Cole leaning against the fence rail, arms crossed, a lazy grin on his face that did not match the sharp assessment in his eyes. Alex was the same age as Jack, and had been his closest friend since their first day of flight training 3 years earlier, back when neither of them had ever expected Earth's small defense fleet to matter much to anyone. "I'm not distracted," Jack said, which was a lie, and Alex knew it. "Your father just left for Concord Station to argue with an alien warlord in front of half the galaxy, and you're not distracted." Alex shook his head. "Sure you're not." Before Jack could answer, a sharp voice cut across the training yard. "Cadet Hale." "Cadet Cole, if you have time to talk, you have time to run the course again." The Jack straightened at once. Commander Elena Rios did not raise her voice often, which was exactly why every cadet under her command had learned to fear the moments when she did not need to. She was a compact woman in her late 40s, with close-cropped gray hair and a kind of stillness that made people assume, wrongly, that she moved slowly. Jack had once watched her put 3 overconfident cadets flat on their backs during hand-to-hand drills, without ever appearing to hurry. "Yes, Commander," Jack said. Rios walked closer, studying him with an expression that was not unkind, only exact. "Your father is a braver man than most soldiers I have ever served with, Hale. He walks into rooms with no weapon and no ship at his back, and he tries to win wars before they start. That is a harder job than mine will ever be." She paused. "But it means that today, of all days, I need you focused on your own work, not his. Can you give me that?" Jack thought of the pocket watch in his jacket pocket, its familiar weight against his chest, and of his father's voice only an hour before. Patience outlasts anger every single time. "Yes, Commander," he said again, and this time he meant it. Rios studied him a moment longer, then nodded once, and turned to address the wider group of cadets gathering nearby. "Earth has been lucky for 3 years. We have held a seat at a very large table, and we have not once had to defend it by force. I want every one of you to understand something clearly. Luck is not a strategy. If the day ever comes when someone tests us, I intend for this fleet to be ready, not lucky. Back to the course, all of you." As the cadets scattered toward the obstacle course, Alex fell into step beside Jack, his earlier teasing gone now, replaced by something more serious. "You really think it could come to that? A real test, like she said?" Jack thought of Warlord Dren's name, spoken so often in his house growing up, that it had taken on the weight of an old family ghost story. He thought of his father's tired eyes at breakfast that morning, the careful way he had said only a little, when Jack asked if he was nervous. "I hope not," Jack said, "but I think my father's been getting ready for it a lot longer than the rest of us have noticed." They ran the course again, and Jack pushed himself harder than the drill required, until his lungs burned, and his mind, finally, went quiet. Now, aboard the Horizon, Thomas set the photograph down gently and returned his attention to the speech waiting on his desk. He read the opening line again. "We are often told that we are young. We do not deny it. But youth, in every corner of the universe that I have ever studied, is not a reason to be dismissed. It is a reason to be given the chance to grow." He thought it was a good line. He hoped the council would think so too. Concord Station came into view 6 hours later, exactly as Iris had promised. Thomas had seen it many times before, and still it took his breath away. The station was enormous, larger than any moon humanity had ever built upon, a vast wheel of metal and light turning slowly against the black of space. It had been built 200 years ago, in the years just after the Long War ended, by the founding species of the Council, as a permanent symbol that peace between different worlds was not just possible, but worth the enormous effort of building something to protect it. Ships of every shape and size drifted toward its many docking arms, like fish swimming toward a great coral reef. The horizon docked smoothly, and Thomas stepped out into the station's wide receiving hall, where the air always smelled faintly of ozone and unfamiliar spices, and where the light was kept carefully neutral so that no single species' preferred temperature or color would make another uncomfortable. It was, Thomas often thought, one of the kindest small details in the entire galaxy, an entire station built to make sure no one ever felt like a stranger in someone else's home. Ambassador Hale. The voice was warm and musical, and Thomas turned to see a tall, blue-skinned figure approaching, robes flowing like water around her steady steps. Elder Sora was one of the eldest living members of the Threll delegation, and had been, since the very beginning, one of the very few voices at the council who had argued passionately for humanity's right to a seat at the table. She and Thomas had become true friends in the 3 years since, in the quiet way that only shared purpose can create. Elder Sora, Thomas bowed his head slightly, a gesture of respect he had learned from her people. I did not expect a welcome party. You did not expect a warning either, I think, Sora said, her large dark eyes studying him carefully as they began to walk together down the wide corridor. But I have one to give. Thomas felt the storm feeling return to his chest. Tell me. Warlord Dren arrived 2 days early, Sora said quietly, her voice pitched low enough that it would not carry to the many other travelers passing by. He has been meeting privately with 3 of the smaller delegations, the Orin, the Feld, even, I am told, with the Marn ambassador, though the Marn have always sided with the council in the past. He is building support against the Halden Reach proposal. I believe so, yes. Thomas exhaled slowly. He had expected resistance. He had not expected Dren to arrive early enough to work the halls like this, quietly turning votes before the meeting had even begun. Then I suppose I will have to work quickly too. Sora stopped walking and turned to face him fully. There was something in her expression Thomas had rarely seen there before. Worry, plain and unguarded. Thomas, I do not say this lightly. Be careful. Dren does not simply want to win the vote. I believe he wants there to be no vote at all. You think he means to delay the proceedings? I think, Sora said, that he means to remove the one voice most likely to convince the council to vote against him. Thomas held her gaze for a long moment. Around them, the station moved on exactly as it always did, merchants calling to each other in 6 different languages, children of 3 different species chasing each other around a fountain that sprayed water that glowed faintly blue, an old Feld musician playing something slow and strange on an instrument Thomas had never learned the name of. Life, ordinary and unconcerned, going on all around a warning that had just quietly changed the shape of everything. I have a family who is counting on me to come home, Thomas said finally. But I also have a promise to a great many families, on Earth and beyond it, who are counting on someone to stand up in that chamber and say that fairness matters more than fear. I cannot walk away from that, Sora, not even for my own safety. Sora studied him for a long moment, and then something in her stern expression softened, just slightly, into something like sad admiration. I did not think you would. I only wanted you to walk in with your eyes open. They are open, Thomas said, wide open. The council chamber was a great circular room at the very center of Concord Station, ringed with seats for every member species, rising in tiers toward a high domed ceiling, painted with the slow-moving image of the galaxy itself, a reminder, Thomas always thought, of exactly how small any single argument really was against the size of everything. Thomas took his seat among the smaller delegations, in the section reserved for observer worlds who had not yet been granted full membership. Even after 3 years, it still stung a little, sitting slightly apart from the full members, though he understood the reasoning. Full membership came with full responsibility, and the council did not hand that out lightly. Across the wide circle, Warlord Dren sat with his own delegation, his bronze armor catching the dome's soft light. He did not look at Thomas directly. He did not need to. His presence alone was a kind of message. The session opened with the usual formalities, a recitation of the long war's ending and the peace that had followed it, words so old and repeated so often across 2 centuries that they had become almost like a hymn. Then the council's presiding elder, an ancient and nearly transparent being of a species called the Ovet, called the chamber to order, and introduced the matter of the day. "The Halden Reach," the presiding elder said, her voice carried through the chamber by some device Thomas had never fully understood, "and the question of whether its resources shall be held in trust for all member worlds, or whether existing territorial claims by the Vex Empire shall be recognized as absolute." Dren rose first, as was his right as the party defending an existing claim. "Honored Council," he began, and his voice was deep and carried easily without any device at all. "The Vex Empire has held the Halden Reach as its own territory for 11 generations. We fought and bled to secure it during the Long War, when many of the worlds now demanding to share its wealth were nowhere to be found on any battlefield." His burning eyes swept slowly across the chamber, and lingered, just for a moment, on the observer section where Thomas sat. "Now that the fighting is over and the treasure has been found, suddenly everyone wishes to be our neighbor. I ask the Council plainly, is this justice, or is this simply greed wearing the mask of fairness?" There was a low murmur through the chamber. Dren sat down, satisfied. Thomas rose. He had given many speeches in 3 years, in this very chamber, but he had never quite gotten used to the way every eye in a room full of different species could still feel the same, waiting, weighing, ready to judge. "Honored Council," Thomas began, his voice steady though his heart was not entirely so. "Warlord Dren speaks of 11 generations of claim, and I do not dispute the courage of the Vex who fought and died in the Long War. That courage deserves honor, not dismissal." He paused, letting that acknowledgement settle before he continued. "But I would ask the Council to consider something else. The Long War ended because every species at that table, 200 years ago, agreed to a simple, difficult idea, that the strength of one people should never again be used to starve another. That is why this station exists. That is why this chamber exists, not to reward whoever arrived first, or whoever fought hardest, but to ensure that no single power, no matter how great, gets to decide alone what the rest of the galaxy is allowed to have." He looked, briefly and deliberately, toward the section where the smallest delegations sat. Species with only 1 or 2 worlds, species with no great fleets of their own, species who depended entirely on the fairness of exactly this kind of vote. "We are often told that we are young," Thomas said, echoing the line from his speech. "My own people most of all. We have been part of this council for 3 years. 3 years, against the 2 centuries some of you have shared together. I do not deny that we are new here. I do not deny that we still have much to learn." His voice grew firmer. "But youth is not a reason to be dismissed. It is a reason to be given the chance to grow, under exactly the same fair rules that every other species at this table was once given, when they too were young and small and uncertain of their place among the stars." He let his gaze rest, finally, directly on Dren. "The Halden Reach is rich enough to lift a dozen small worlds out of poverty, worlds that have no claim of conquest to offer, only need. I ask the Council to hold it in trust, shared fairly, protected equally, exactly as this very chamber was built to ensure. Not because the Vex do not deserve their share, they do, but because no single empire, however proud its history, should be permitted to hold the future of so many others in one closed fist." He sat down. The chamber was very quiet. Then, slowly, from the section where the smaller delegations sat, a soft sound of approval rose, hands or equivalent limbs striking against seats in the various ways different species showed agreement. It was not overwhelming, it was not a victory, but it was something, and Thomas felt his heart lift slightly, even as he saw, across the chamber, the look on Dren's face. It was not anger. Anger, Thomas might have known how to answer. It was something colder than that. It was the look of a man recalculating. As the chamber began to empty, a small, round-bodied delegate made her way against the tide of departing representatives until she stood before Thomas, her wide eyes blinking slowly, in the way Thomas had learned meant deep feeling among her people, the Orin. "Ambassador Hale," her voice was small and careful, several tones higher than a human voice, carried through a translation device clipped to her robes. "My world has 3 million people, and not one warship worth the name. If the reach is closed to us, we cannot feed the colonies we have already built there. I wished only to say, before I return to my seat, that your words today were the first I have heard in this chamber in many years that did not sound like calculation." "Thank you," Thomas said, and meant it fully. "I hope the vote reflects that when it comes." "So do I," the Oran ambassador said, and touched 2 fingers briefly to her chest, a gesture Thomas had come to recognize as a promise, before turning to rejoin her own delegation. Thomas watched her go and felt, for just a moment, the plain and uncomplicated satisfaction of having said something true, and having it land exactly where it needed to. It was a small thing, in a chamber built to decide the fates of entire star systems. It did not feel small to him. The session ended without a vote. The presiding elder announced that the council would reconvene in 3 days to allow further private discussion among the delegations, a common enough delay, though Thomas felt its timing keenly. 3 more days on Concord Station, 3 more days for Dren to work the halls. That evening, Sora found him again, this time in one of the station's quiet observation decks, where a great curved window looked out over the slow-turning stars. "Your speech moved the smaller worlds," she said, coming to stand beside him at the window. "I could see it." The Oran delegate wept, in her own way, when you spoke of need. "It's not enough," Thomas said. "Not if Dren has already turned 3 delegations before I even walked into the chamber." "No," Sora agreed. "It may not be. But Thomas, listen to me now. Truly listen. There are ways to lose a vote, and there are ways to lose far more than a vote. I have heard whispers tonight since the session ended that trouble me deeply. A private security contractor, unaffiliated with any delegation's official guard, was seen boarding the station only hours before Dren's own early arrival. Mercenaries. Vex mercenaries. If the whispers are true, officially deniable. Unofficially, exactly the sort of hands a warlord might use for work he does not wish, traced back to his own soldiers." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, watching the stars. Somewhere out there, invisible at this distance, was Earth, was Sarah, probably asleep by now, was Emily, likely still awake reading long past when she should have gone to bed, was Jack, perhaps lying awake himself, turning an old pocket watch over in his hand and wondering what it meant. "What would you have me do, Sora?" Thomas asked quietly. "Leave? Let the vote fail by default? Let every small world in the Reach go hungry because I was too frightened to stay 3 more days?" "I would have you be careful," Sora said. "That is all. I am not asking you to abandon your purpose. I am asking you to remember that purpose serves nothing if you are not alive to see it through." Thomas managed a small, tired smile. "You sound like my wife." "Your wife," Sora said, "sounds like a wise woman." They stood together in silence for a while longer, watching the great slow wheel of stars, 2 friends from 2 different worlds who had found, against every improbable odds of history and distance, that they wanted the very same thing, a galaxy fair enough for their children to inherit. Half a galaxy away, on the morning after the council session ended without a vote, Sarah Hale stood in her kitchen and did not make the coffee too strong, because for once, she was not the one who was nervous. That distinction belonged to Emily. "He hasn't messaged," Emily said, for the 3rd time that morning, turning her tablet over in her hands, as though a different angle might reveal a message that was not actually there. "It's been 4 days, Mom. Deep space relay is slow, sweetheart. You know that." Sarah poured 2 glasses of juice, more from habit than hunger, and set one in front of her daughter. "Your father will call the moment he has a real update. No news is good news." "That's not actually true, though," Emily said. "That's just a thing people say." Sarah almost laughed, because it was such a precisely Emily thing to say, unwilling even at 15 to accept comfort that could not survive close examination. It was, Sarah privately thought, exactly her father's habit of mind, inherited whole. "All right," Sarah admitted, sitting down across from her. "It isn't always true, but your father is careful, and he is surrounded by people who respect him, even the ones who disagree with him. I choose to believe good news, because the alternative does neither of us any good while we wait." Emily was quiet for a moment, turning her glass in slow circles on the table. Do you ever wish he'd picked a job that didn't involve alien warlords? Every single day, Sarah said honestly. And every single day I remember that if he hadn't taken this job, it might have gone to someone who cared far less whether people like us were treated fairly. That's usually enough to settle my mind back down. Usually. Usually, Sarah agreed, and reached across the table to squeeze her daughter's hand. Later that evening, Jack stopped by after his training shift, still half in uniform, his hair damp from a hurried shower. He did not say much, only sat with them through dinner, answering Emily's rapid questions about flight drills with more patience than he generally showed his sister. And once, when he thought no one was looking, Sarah saw him reach into his jacket pocket and press his thumb briefly against something small and hard inside it, the way a person touches a coin for luck. She did not ask what it was. She had a feeling she already knew. "He's going to be fine," Jack said later, as he was leaving, pausing at the door with his hand on the frame. He said it the way a person says a thing they need to be true, rather than a thing they are certain of. And Sarah, who had been saying nearly the same words to Emily all day, recognized the tone immediately, because it was her own. "I know," she said, and hugged her son good night, and did not let him see how tightly she held on for just 1 second longer than usual. Late that night, long after most of the station's public spaces had quieted, Thomas made his way back toward his docked ship through one of the station's narrower connecting corridors, a shortcut he had used many times before without incident. His mind was still turning over the day's events, still composing, out of old habit, the arguments he would need for the next session. He almost did not notice the two figures step out of a side passage behind him until it was nearly too late. He turned at the sound of a boot against metal, and in the dim emergency lighting of the corridor, he saw them clearly enough, not Vex soldiers in official uniform, but hired men in dark, unmarked armor, the kind that told a story of its own, simply by refusing to tell any story at all. Thomas's hand went instinctively to the small emergency transmitter clipped to his collar, the one every council delegate carried, the one he had never once had to use in 3 years. "Ambassador Hale," one of the figures said, his voice flat behind a dark visor. "Warlord Dren sends his regards." Thomas's thumb found the transmitter's small activation switch, even as his heart began to pound hard against his ribs. He thought, with sudden and startling clarity, of Sarah's hands on his face at the shuttle port. "Come home to us." He thought of Jack turning the old watch over in his palm, not yet understanding what it meant. He thought of Emily's laugh in the photograph on his desk. "Always," he had told Sarah, "always." The corridor lights flickered once, and then the first figure moved. Thomas pressed the transmitter switch with the last full measure of calm he had left, and somewhere far above the station, unseen and unheard, a single short burst of emergency code began its long, silent journey outward into the dark. The first figure moved fast, faster than Thomas expected from someone wearing that much armor, and there was no time to run, and nowhere to run to. Thomas twisted sideways on instinct alone, the way no diplomat is ever trained to move but every frightened animal somehow knows how, and the strike that should have caught him square in the chest caught his shoulder instead. White light, a sound like the air itself tearing. Then heat, terrible and total, spreading down his left side, and Thomas found himself on the floor of the corridor without having felt himself fall. He heard boots, 2 sets, maybe 3, and low voices arguing in short, clipped words he did not have the strength left to translate. He heard, distantly, an alarm begin to sound somewhere above him, the station's own systems finally catching up to what his emergency transmitter had already reported. He heard one of the voices swear, sharp and sudden, and then the boots were retreating, fast, back the way they had come, because hired men paid to make a quiet problem disappear had no interest in being found standing over a council ambassador when station security arrived. Then it was quiet, except for the alarm, and except for Thomas's own breathing, which had gone strange and shallow, in a way that frightened him more than the pain did. He lay on his back and looked up at the corridor's dim emergency lights and thought, with the odd clarity that sometimes visits people in the worst moments of their lives, that the lights were not so different from starlight if he let his eyes go soft enough. Elder Sora reached him first. She had been in her own quarters, unable to sleep, turning over her own private worry about the mercenaries the whispers had described. when the station's general alarm sounded through every corridor at once. She had known, with a certainty she could not explain and did not try to, exactly whose alarm it must be. She found him a few minutes later, and the sight of him on the corridor floor struck her like a physical blow. She dropped to her knees beside him, her robes pooling around her, and pressed both hands to the wound at his shoulder, though she already understood, with the long, clear sight of a woman who had buried more friends than most species live long enough to have, that pressure alone would not be enough. "Thomas, Thomas, look at me." His eyes found hers, and though his face was gray with shock, he managed something that was almost a smile. "Sora, you always did tell me to be careful. Do not speak. Medical is coming. I have called them myself." "I can hear them coming," Thomas said. And it was true. Distant footsteps, many of them, hurrying down the corridor. "But Sora, listen to me. I do not think I have very much time, and there is something I need to do before anyone tries to convince me to save my strength instead." "Thomas, please." His hand found her wrist, weak but insistent. "You know what this wound means. I can see it in your face. You have never been able to hide anything from me, not in 3 years." Sora's composure, famous across the council for never once cracking in public, cracked now, just slightly, at the corners of her ancient eyes. "I would take the wound myself, if such a thing were possible." "I know," Thomas said. "That is exactly why I need your help, and not a stranger's, for what comes next." The station's medical team arrived within minutes, and they worked over him with the calm, terrible efficiency of people trained for exactly this kind of moment. But even they, gathered around him with their instruments and their quiet, careful words, could not undo what the weapon had already done. The wound had gone deep, past what their equipment could repair in the time that remained, and the senior medic, a broad-shouldered being of a species Thomas had never learned to identify, met Sora's eyes over his patient's body and gave the smallest, saddest shake of her head. Thomas saw it too. He had spent 30 years learning to read the small, true things beneath people's careful words, and he did not need language at all to understand what that shake of the head meant. "Sora," he said, his voice thinner now than it had been even minutes before. "The communicator. The station's open channel, the one that reaches every delegation at once. Can you bring it to me? Thomas, you should rest. You should let them." "There is no time left for rest," he said, gently, but with a firmness that silenced her protest before it fully formed. "There is only time for this. Please, my friend. I am asking you for the last thing I will ever ask you." Sora looked at him for a long moment, her ancient eyes bright with grief she had not yet allowed herself to feel fully, and then she nodded, once, and rose to find what he needed. It took only a few minutes to bring a small portable transmitter to his side and to patch it into the station's open emergency channel, the one that, by long tradition and council law, could never be blocked or filtered by any single delegation, no matter how powerful. It existed for exactly this purpose, so that in the galaxy's very worst moments, no one with something urgent to say could ever be silenced by those who did not wish to hear it. The medical team stepped back, giving him what little space and time they could. Sora knelt beside him and held the small device close enough for him to speak into, her other hand wrapped tightly around his. Thomas closed his eyes for just a moment, gathering whatever strength remained to him, and then he began to speak, his voice weaker than it had ever been in any chamber, but steady, in the way that mattered most. "People of the Council, people of Earth, I do not have long, so I will say only what matters most. Tonight, hired hands tried to silence me, because I asked this council to be fair. I do not know if I will live to see the sun rise over Concord Station again, but I have already seen enough, in these last few minutes, to understand one thing very clearly. Fear makes tyrants of the powerful, and silence makes victims of everyone else. Warlord Dren, if you are listening, know this. You have not silenced me tonight. You have only shown every species watching exactly what kind of galaxy you intend to build, if no one stops you. To the Council, I ask only what I have always asked. Do not let fear decide this vote. Do not let force become the only language spoken among the stars, or one day it will be the only language left. To Earth, my home, I ask something harder. Do not let my death become only a wound to avenge. Let it become a reason to stand taller, to demand fairness louder, and to never mistake cruelty for strength. If you seek justice, seek it the way I tried to live, with courage, and without cruelty of your own. And to my wife Sarah, my daughter Emily, my son Jack, I am sorry I will not come home to you, as I promised I would. But everything I did here, I did so that one day, you would not need ambassadors like me at all, because fairness would simply be how the galaxy works. I love you more than these words can ever hold. Remember what I told you, Jack, before I left. Patience outlasts anger, every single time. I believe that tonight more than I have ever believed anything in my life. This is Ambassador Thomas Hale, speaking for Earth, for the last time. Do not let this be the end of what we tried to build here. Let it be the beginning of something the whole galaxy still owes itself. His voice failed on the final word, more from exhaustion than anything else, and the small transmitter clicked once and went dark in Sora's hand. Thomas looked up at her, and his eyes, though dimming now, were calm. Did it send? It sent, Sora said, her voice breaking at last, the composure of 300 years finally giving way. Every delegation on this station heard it. I promise you that, Thomas. Every single one. Good, he whispered. That's good. He thought, in the last clear moment left to him, not of Dren, not of the council, not even of the vote he would never see decided. He thought of Sarah's hands on his face at the shuttle port. He thought of Emily's laugh in an old photograph. He thought of Jack, 23 years old and trying so hard to be steady, holding an old pocket watch that did not tell very good time, but had never needed to. Tell them I kept my promise, he said, so quietly that only Sora, leaning close, could hear it at all. Tell them I came home, just not the way I meant to. Elder Sora held his hand until the very end, and did not let go for a long while after, even when the medical team, with great gentleness, told her that there was nothing more to be done. Word of Ambassador Hale's death spread through Concord Station faster than any official announcement could have managed, carried first by the emergency broadcast itself, and then by the thousand smaller conversations of beings who had heard it with their own ears, and could not quite believe what they had heard. By the following morning, every delegation on the station knew not only that Earth's ambassador was dead, but exactly how he had died, and exactly whose name he had spoken as he lay dying. The reaction was not what Warlord Dren had planned for. He had believed, in the cold calculation that passed for strategy among his own people, that removing one troublesome voice would remove one troublesome obstacle, cleanly and quietly, the way such things had always been managed in the past. He had not accounted for the open channel. He had not accounted for a dying man's steadiness, or for the particular, unbearable weight of hearing someone speak calmly about their own murder in real time, their voice growing fainter with every sentence. Delegations that had never spoken to each other on any matter found themselves, that morning, speaking of nothing else. The Oran ambassador wept openly in the council's public gardens, in the way her species wept, a low sound like wind through reeds, and did not seem to care who saw her. The Feld delegation, who had quietly agreed to side with Dren only 2 days before, withdrew their support before the sun had fully risen over the station's artificial day cycle. Even the Marn ambassador, who had always kept careful neutral distance from every dispute, requested an emergency session to discuss what she called, plainly, an act of war conducted in the shadow of peace. Dren, for his part, denied any involvement, exactly as Thomas had known he would. The mercenaries who had carried out the attack had vanished as thoroughly as such men were paid to vanish, leaving nothing that could be proven in any council court. But proof, Sora reflected bitterly in the days that followed, had never really been the point. Everyone who mattered already knew the truth. Thomas Hale had made certain of that with the very last minutes of his life. News of the ambassador's death and his final words spread far beyond the council chamber itself, carried across 100 worlds by the same open emergency channel that had once been built only for moments of desperate necessity. On the Threll homeworld, citizens who had never given humanity a single thought gathered in quiet vigil beneath the twin moons, playing the recording of a species they had barely met, speak of fairness with his dying breath. On a dozen smaller worlds throughout the reach, Worlds with no fleets and no voice loud enough to be heard alone. People who had never expected anyone to advocate for them without asking anything in return, found themselves, for the first time in a generation, unwilling to stay silent. 2 days after the funeral was announced on Earth, the Galactic Council convened an emergency session, the first called outside the normal calendar in over a decade. Elder Sora rose to address the full chamber, and for the first time in 3 years of careful diplomacy, she did not speak with careful diplomacy at all. "I held Ambassador Hale's hand as he died," she told the assembled delegations, her voice carrying to every corner of the great domed chamber, without need of any device. "I heard him record his own eulogy, because he did not trust that anyone else would be permitted to speak the truth of what happened to him. I ask this council plainly, how many more voices must be silenced before we admit that silence is exactly what is being purchased?" Warlord Dren sat through the session with his arms folded, and his expression carved from the same bronze as his armor, offering only the same flat denial he had offered from the first hour. "The Vex Empire mourns any loss of diplomatic life," he said, when at last called upon to respond. "But I will not accept blame for the actions of criminals my empire does not control, based on nothing more than a dying man's final words." It was, Sora thought privately, watching him, a technically correct statement, and also the coldest thing she had ever heard spoken in that chamber in 300 years of attending it. Not every member of the Vex delegation shared his composure. Later that same evening, in a private meeting room far from the main chamber, a senior Vex strategist named Kale, who had served 2 warlords before Dren, and had grown old enough to remember when the Vex Empire had still called itself a defender of the Council, rather than its rival, confronted Dren alone. "You have made us into the villain of every broadcast in known space," Kale said, not troubling to soften his voice, though he kept it low enough that no recording device could easily catch it. "Whatever you hope to gain from the Halden Reach, you have spent 10 times its worth in trust we will need for the next 100 years. Trust," Dren said with open contempt, "is not the currency that built this empire. Strength is. The humans will bluster and grieve and eventually go quiet, exactly as every other small species has before them. In a year, no one outside their own solar system will remember the ambassador's name." Kale studied him for a long moment, an old soldier's caution in his eyes. "I served under warlords who believed exactly that about species, who later became this empire's fiercest enemies. I hope, for your sake, and for all of ours, that you are wiser than they were." "I do not think you are." Dren said nothing to that, and Kale left without waiting for a response. If any small doubt found its way into the warlord's carefully calculated confidence that night, he was far too proud to ever let it show. 3 weeks later, though the story did not make as many headlines as the funeral itself, the Galactic Council voted, by a margin that would have been unthinkable only a month before, to place the Halden Reach under permanent shared protection, open to every member world in equal measure. It was, in the end, exactly the outcome Thomas Hale had spent his final weeks fighting for, though he did not live to see the vote counted, and no one who mourned him found much comfort in the timing. On Earth, the message arrived in the middle of the night. It reached ordinary broadcast networks within hours of leaving Concord Station, translated and retranslated as it passed from relay to relay across the vast distance, until it finally reached human ears, exactly as Thomas had spoken it, word for word, his voice a little rough with static, but unmistakably his own. Sarah Hale was asleep when it happened. She woke to the sound of her phone chiming, again and again, far more than any reasonable hour should allow, and when she finally answered it, still half caught in sleep, it was not a voice on the other end at all. It was a recording, forwarded from an emergency council relay station, and after only a few seconds of listening, Sarah understood, with a kind of falling, sickening certainty, exactly what she was hearing. She did not remember crossing the hallway to Emily's room. She only remembered standing in the doorway, her daughter's name caught somewhere in her throat, unable to come out, until Emily woke on her own and saw her mother's face in the dim light and understood, the way children sometimes understand the worst things before any words are spoken, that something had happened to her father. "Mom?" Emily's voice was very small. "Mom, what is it?" Sarah crossed the room and sat on the edge of her daughter's bed and took both of Emily's hands in her own, the way Thomas always used to hold Sarah's face, and found that there was no gentle way to say the thing she had to say, so she simply said it. "Your father is gone, sweetheart. There was an attack. On the station. He didn't make it." Emily did not cry at first. She only stared at her mother, as though waiting for the sentence to rearrange itself into something that made more sense, something survivable. Then, slowly, her face crumpled, and she made a sound Sarah had never heard her daughter make before, not even as a small child. A sound with no words in it at all, only loss. Sarah held her, and did not try to say anything more, because there was nothing more that could help, and because she was crying too hard herself to have managed words, even if there had been any worth saying. Jack Hale heard the news from Alex Cole, who arrived at his apartment door before dawn, his face already telling most of the story before he had said a single word. "Jack." Alex's voice was rough. "You need to sit down." "Just tell me," Jack said, though some part of him, some old, quiet animal part, already knew, the way he had known something was wrong, the moment he saw his friend's face in the doorway at that hour. Alex told him. Jack did not cry, not then, not in front of Alex. He stood very still in his own doorway, his hand finding, almost without his own permission, the small, hard shape of the pocket watch he now carried everywhere, tucked into whatever pocket was nearest, the way another man might carry a photograph or a prayer. "They're playing the message on every channel," Alex said quietly. His last words, "I thought you should hear it from someone who cares about you first, not from a screen." "I need to hear it," Jack said. "Play it." Alex hesitated, then found the recording on his own device and played it. And Jack stood in his doorway and listened to his father's voice, tired and steady, and unmistakably his own, speaking calmly about council votes and galactic fairness, and hired hands sent to silence him, right up until the moment his father said his name. "Remember what I told you, Jack, before I left. Patience outlasts anger, every single time." Jack closed his eyes. He thought of the training yard, only days ago, Commander Rios telling him that luck was not a strategy. He thought of his father's tired smile at the breakfast table, saying only a little when Jack had asked if he was nervous. He thought of the shuttle port, and his father's hand pressing the old watch into his own. Something in his chest, some careful, controlled thing he had spent his whole life keeping still and quiet, cracked open at last. And for the first time since he was a very small boy, Jack Hale wept, standing in his own doorway, while his closest friend held the recording of a dead man's voice, and did not know what else there was to do except stand there with him. By midday, the recording had reached every continent, translated into every major language, replayed on every news channel, and shared privately a countless number of times over on every network humanity had ever built. Strangers who had never given much thought to the council, or to the strange blue-skinned diplomats occasionally shown on the news, found themselves standing in kitchens and offices and school hallways, listening to a man they had never met speak calmly about his own death and about the family he would not be coming home to. Candlelight vigils formed that evening in city squares across a dozen countries, small and spontaneous, without any organizing group behind them at all, simply people who felt that something enormous and frightening had happened to their small young place among the stars, and did not want to face it entirely alone. Not everyone reacted with grief alone. In comment sections and radio call-in shows and hurried government briefings, a harder question began to circulate. If the Vex Empire could reach into the heart of a neutral diplomatic station and kill a sitting ambassador without consequence, what exactly was stopping them from reaching further, into Earth's own skies, whenever they judged it convenient? Fear and grief, Sarah Hale would later say in a rare public interview, had arrived in her country at almost exactly the same hour, and she was never entirely sure, looking back, which of the two had done more to shape what came next. When Emily returned to school 4 days later, at her own insistence, because she said staying home made the house feel too quiet, her classmates did not know what to say to her, and mostly said nothing at all, which she found she preferred. Only her closest friend, a girl named Priya who had known Emily since they were both small enough to still believe the world was mostly kind, sat beside her at lunch without saying a word, and simply stayed, which turned out to be exactly the right thing to do. Sarah, meanwhile, found herself besieged by reporters, letters, and a steady, well-meaning flood of casseroles from neighbors who did not quite know how else to help a woman whose husband had died somewhere among the stars, rather than in any hospital they could have visited. She was grateful for all of it, and exhausted by all of it, and mostly she simply wanted her children safe under the same roof as her, at least for a little while, before the wider galaxy asked anything more of any of them. Earth's Unity Council, the small civilian body that governed humanity's affairs on matters that touched the wider galaxy, met in emergency session within a day of the news reaching Earth. Commander Elena Rios, freshly promoted in the confusion of the crisis to Admiral, one of the very first such promotions in the short history of Earth's defense fleet, addressed the assembled council members with the same plain, exact voice she used on her cadets. For 3 years, we have had the luxury of being small and unnoticed, Rios told them. That luxury ended the moment Ambassador Hale's message reached every network on this planet. Every species in the Galactic Council now knows exactly how far the Vex Empire is willing to go to silence a voice they find inconvenient. We must ask ourselves, honestly, whether we believe our own voice is safe from the same treatment. A representative from the Eastern Continental Bloc, a heavyset man named Director Okafor, leaned forward with his hands folded tightly together. Admiral, our fleet consists of 40 ships, most of them built for planetary defense and search and rescue, not war. Whatever the Vex Empire is capable of, we are not remotely prepared to answer it in kind. I am not proposing we answer it in kind tomorrow, Rios said. I am proposing we stop pretending we have the option of staying small forever. Ambassador Hale bought us something precious with his death, whether he intended to or not. He bought us the galaxy's attention, and in some cases, its sympathy. I would rather we use both, carefully, than waste them out of fear. The debate that followed lasted long into the night, and it would continue, in one form or another, for weeks after. But by the time it ended, the Unity Council had agreed to 2 things, without much further argument. That Ambassador Thomas Hale would be honored with the largest state funeral Earth had held in living memory, and that Earth's small defense fleet would begin, immediately, an expansion and training program unlike anything attempted since humanity first learned it was not alone in the universe. The funeral was held 6 days later, in the wide green square outside the old United Nations building in New York, the same building where Thomas had once worked as a young diplomat, mostly ignored by the people who mattered. No one ignored him now. Representatives from 4 different alien species stood among the crowd that day, an unprecedented sight in the short history of human and alien contact, drawn by respect, by grief, and in some cases, Jack suspected, by a very careful political interest in being seen standing with humanity in its darkest hour. Elder Sora herself had traveled all the way from Concord Station to attend, and she stood near the front of the gathered crowd beside Sarah, the 2 of them united by a grief that needed no shared language to be understood. Jack stood in his dress uniform beside his mother and sister, the old pocket watch heavy in his breast pocket, and listened as speaker after speaker rose to talk about his father's courage, his patience, his stubborn belief that fairness was worth fighting for, even when fighting for it cost everything. He heard the recording of his father's final message played once more, to the entire gathered crowd, his father's tired, steady voice carrying across the green square and out over a city that had, in the space of one impossible week, become part of a much larger and much more dangerous galaxy than it had ever imagined itself to belong to. When it was Jack's turn to speak, he had not prepared anything. He stood at the small podium, looked out at the crowd, at his mother's tear-streaked face, at Emily's small, brave attempt at composure, at Elder Sora's ancient, sorrowful eyes, and found that the only words that came to him were the truest ones he had. My father told me once that patience outlasts anger, every single time, Jack said, his voice carrying further than he expected across the quiet square. I believed him, because I always believed him. I still believe him. But I want everyone here to understand something else my father believed, just as deeply. He believed that patience was never the same thing as standing still. He spent his whole life being patient and being fair, and it did not stop them from killing him for it. Jack's hands, gripping the edges of the podium, were steady, though his voice shook slightly with the effort of keeping it so. So I promise this. Earth will be patient, the way my father asked us to be. We will not become cruel, simply because someone was cruel to us first. But we will not stand still either. Not anymore. He stepped back from the podium to the sound of a silence that felt, somehow, louder than applause would have been. A whole green square full of grieving people and grieving strangers from other worlds, all holding the same breath together. After the ceremony ended and the crowd slowly began to disperse, Elder Sora found Sarah standing alone near the edge of the square, watching the last of the alien dignitaries return to their transport vehicles. "He spoke of you often," Sora said quietly, coming to stand beside her. "More often than protocol strictly required of him, I think. He once told me that he measured every treaty he negotiated by a very simple question. Would this make the galaxy safer for Sarah and the children? I do not think he ever stopped asking himself that question, in 3 years of very difficult work." Sarah's eyes filled again, though she had thought there could not possibly be any tears left in her after the last 6 days. "He used to say something similar to me, that he wasn't trying to save the whole galaxy, just enough of it that we'd still recognize it, by the time he came home." "He came home," Sora said gently. "Not the way either of you wanted, but he came home to more people than you know. Sarah Hale, I have watched delegations that would not once look a human ambassador in the eye, now speak his name with something close to reverence. That is not nothing. I do not offer it as comfort for your loss, because I know it cannot truly be that. I offer it only because I think you deserve to know it is true." Sarah reached out and took the elder's hand, an oddly human gesture that Sora nonetheless returned without hesitation. "Thank you for staying with him. At the end, I don't think I could bear it, if he'd been alone." "He was never alone," Sora said. "Not for one single moment. I made certain of that, and I would make the same choice again, without any hesitation at all." The two women stood together a while longer in the emptying square, an ambassador's widow and an ancient elder from a world 40 light-years away, bound now by a grief that had, in its own strange way, made them something like family. That night, alone in his old childhood bedroom, Jack took out his father's pocket watch and turned it over slowly in his hands, tracing the worn silver case with his thumb, the way his father used to. He thought of Commander Rios's words in the training yard, only a little more than a week ago now, though it felt like a different lifetime. Luck is not a strategy. He thought of his father's final words, broadcast across an entire galaxy. "Do not let my death become only a wound to avenge." Jack closed his hand around the watch and made himself a private promise that he did not yet fully understand the shape of, though he suspected, even then, that it would take him somewhere very far from the quiet green square where he had just said goodbye to his father in front of half the world. The next morning, Jack requested a private meeting with Admiral Rios, and was given 15 minutes between her own packed schedule of briefings, which he suspected was 15 minutes more than she could easily spare that week. "I want a combat assignment," Jack said, before she had even fully closed her office door. "Not training, not ceremonial escort. Whatever Earth builds next to answer this, I want to be part of it from the first ship." Rios studied him for a long moment from behind her desk, her expression giving away nothing. "Sit down, Cadet Hale." Jack sat. "You buried your father 4 days ago," Rios said. "I have seen good officers ruined by grief. They tried to turn into fuel too quickly. I need to know which one you are before I put you anywhere near a cockpit that matters." "I'm not asking out of grief," Jack said, though even as he said it, he understood it was not entirely true, and suspected Rios understood that too. "Or not only grief. My father asked Earth not to let his death become only a wound to avenge. I heard him say it myself, same as everyone else did. I don't want revenge, Admiral. I want to make sure nobody else's father has to record his own funeral, because a warlord decided he was inconvenient. I don't see how staying in basic training gets us any closer to that." Rios was quiet for a moment, and something in her carefully controlled face shifted, just slightly, into something that might, on a less disciplined officer, have been called sympathy. "Your father and I disagreed about a great many things over the years. Politics was never my trade, and diplomacy never much interested me. But he told me once that Earth's whole future depended on becoming strong without becoming cruel, and I have thought about that more since his death than I care to admit." She rose from her desk and crossed to the window of her office, which looked out over the training yard where, only a little more than a week ago, Jack had run an obstacle course to keep from thinking about his father's meeting on Concord Station. "Earth is building a new fleet," she said, without turning around. "Not 40 ships anymore. We have already begun negotiating for Allied support, and for new ships beyond anything our own shipyards have built before. It will take months before any of it is ready to leave this system, and longer still before it is ready to do anything more than defend our own borders. When it is ready, I intend to command it myself, and I intend to handpick every officer who serves under me." She turned back to face him. "I will not promise you a place on that fleet today, Jack. I will promise you this. You train harder than any cadet under my command for the next 6 months, and you show me you can carry your father's patience into a cockpit without losing yourself the first time someone shoots back at you, and I will consider you for it myself. That is the only promise I have to give an officer who buried his father 4 days ago, and is already asking me for a war." "That's enough, Admiral," Jack said. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Rios said, not unkindly. "Thank me in 6 months, if you've earned it." Jack left her office that afternoon feeling, for the first time since Alex Cole's face had appeared in his doorway before dawn, something that was not quite grief and not quite anger, but some third thing, steadier than either, that he did not yet have a name for. Somewhere out among the stars, he thought, there is a warlord who believes he has already won. Jack intended to make very certain that he was wrong. 6 months after Ambassador Thomas Hale was laid to rest in the green square outside the old United Nations building, Warlord Dren did the one thing that Elder Sora, in all her 300 years of careful diplomacy, had quietly hoped he would not do. He ignored the Council's vote entirely. The Halden Reach had been placed under shared protection, open to every member world in equal measure, exactly as Thomas had argued it should be, with the very last strength of his life. For a few months, an uneasy peace had held. Then, without warning or announcement, Vex warships began gathering at the edge of the Reach, in numbers too large to be explained as routine patrols. Small mining outposts belonging to neutral species were boarded, and their crews expelled at gunpoint. A Council monitoring station, unarmed and clearly marked, was destroyed by what the Vex Empire called, without any real attempt at a convincing excuse, an unfortunate accident during a training exercise. Dren was not merely defying the vote. He was showing the entire galaxy, deliberately and without apology, exactly how little the vote had ever meant to him. "He has decided," Elder Sora said, standing before an emergency session of the Council, for the second time in half a year, that a vote he cannot win is not a vote worth respecting. "I would remind this chamber that the very foundation of everything we have built since the Long War rests on the opposite belief. If we allow this to stand unanswered, we are not simply losing the Halden Reach. We are announcing to every ambitious power in this galaxy that our votes are suggestions, and our borders are only as real as our willingness to fight for them." A delegate from a small, insectoid species called the Van, who had said little in council sessions before that day, rose to speak next, her many-jointed hands trembling slightly. Whether from age or fear, Sora could not tell. "The Van homeworld lies less than 2 days' travel from the Halden Reach. We have no fleet worth mentioning in a chamber like this one. If the Council chooses war, and that war goes badly, it will not be Threll cities or human cities that burn first. It will be ours. I do not say this to argue against action. I say it because I believe this chamber sometimes forgets how differently the same vote can land, depending on which world you go home to afterward." Sora inclined her head toward the Van delegate with genuine respect. "I have not forgotten. I do not believe anyone who has followed this matter closely could forget it. That is precisely why inaction frightens me as much as action does. If Dren succeeds in taking the Reach by force after losing it by vote, no small world in this chamber will ever again be protected by anything but the size of its neighbors' armies. The vote we are truly casting today is not about the Reach at all. It is about whether a vote means anything, for any of us, ever again." The emergency session lasted through most of that day and into the following one, and by its end, the Council had authorized what its own official record modestly called a defensive coalition action, though everyone present understood it for what it actually was. The first real mobilization for war the Galactic Council had approved in over 200 years. Half a galaxy away, aboard his flagship at the edge of the Reach, Warlord Dren received word of the Council's decision without any visible reaction at all. He had expected it, in the same cold, patient way he expected most things. What he had not expected, 6 months earlier, was how thoroughly a dying man's last words would reshape the very alliance he had hoped to fracture. He had meant to remove one obstacle. Instead, he had watched smaller species, who had never once agreed on anything, find, for the first time in generations, a single cause they could all stand behind. It was, though he would never have admitted it aloud to anyone, the only miscalculation of his long career that genuinely troubled him. "Let them come, then," he told Kale, who stood at his side aboard the Ashkar's Pride, studying the same reports with far greater unease than his warlord allowed himself to show. A coalition of the frightened and the young is still a coalition of the frightened and the young. When we take the Reach in full view of their entire assembled fleet, this alliance of theirs will learn exactly how little unity is worth against real strength. Kale said nothing, though privately, watching the sensor reports of Earth's rapidly expanding fleet numbers, he found himself thinking of his own warning from 6 months before, and wondering, not for the first time, whether his warlord's confidence was wisdom or simply pride wearing a uniform. On Earth, the news reached the Unity Council within hours, and this time there was no long debate about whether humanity could afford to remain small and unnoticed. That question had already been answered for them, 6 months earlier, in a corridor on Concord Station. Admiral Elena Rios stood before the assembled council members, no longer the newly promoted officer stumbling through her first emergency briefing, but a woman who had spent half a year building something out of very little. "In 6 months," Rios told them, "we have gone from 40 ships built for search and rescue to a fleet of 120 vessels, 20 of them true warships, built with the Threll's help and paid for, in part, by the sympathy Ambassador Hale's death purchased for us across a dozen worlds. That is not an army capable of defeating the Vex Empire alone. It was never meant to be. But the Threll have committed 30 warships of their own to a joint defense of the Halden Reach, and 4 smaller member species have pledged support ships and supplies. For the first time in our short history among the stars, Earth will not be fighting alone, and for the first time, Earth will not merely be defended. We will be asked to help lead." Director Okafor, older now around the eyes than he had been 6 months before, folded his hands the way he always did, before saying something difficult. "Leading a coalition fleet is a very different thing than defending our own solar system, Admiral. Are we prepared for what that will cost us, if it comes to real battle?" "No," Rios said simply. "No one is ever fully prepared for that, Director. But I would rather be underprepared and standing beside allies than perfectly safe and standing alone, which is the only other choice left to us now." The vote to commit Earth's new fleet to the joint defense of the Halden Reach passed that same evening, with only a small handful of dissenting voices, mostly belonging to those who still believed, quietly and understandably, that any war at all was a war humanity could not survive. Not every voice on Earth agreed with the direction the Unity Council had chosen. In the weeks that followed, a growing movement calling itself the Steady Path held gatherings in cities across the world, arguing that Ambassador Hale's own final words, if truly listened to, argued against exactly this kind of military escalation. Its leader, a former colleague of Thomas's named Dr. Amara Voss, who had worked beside him at the United Nations years before either of them had ever expected to matter to the wider galaxy, gave interviews, arguing that Earth risked losing the very thing that had made Thomas's death meaningful in the first place. "He asked us not to let his death become only a wound to avenge," Dr. Voss said, in one widely shared broadcast. "I fear that is precisely what we are now building, one warship at a time, however carefully we dress it in the language of coalition and defense. I do not say this to dishonor his memory. I say it because I believe I understood his actual beliefs better than most of the people currently invoking his name to justify a fleet." Admiral Rios, when asked about the Steady Path movement in a rare public interview, did not dismiss it outright. "Dr. Voss is not wrong that Ambassador Hale hated the idea of cruelty answering cruelty," she said. "I hated the idea of watching Vex warships take the Halden Reach by force, after that same man spent his life arguing it belonged to everyone, while the rest of us congratulated ourselves for staying peaceful from a safe distance. I do not think those two positions are as far apart as they sound. I simply believe, in the end, that some things must be defended, or fairness becomes nothing more than a comforting word we say to each other, while stronger hands take whatever they like. Sarah Hale watched Dr. Voss's broadcast alone, late one night, long after Emily had gone to bed, and found that she could not fully disagree with it, even as she understood, just as clearly, why Jack and Rios, and so many others had chosen the path they had. She had loved a man who believed, all the way to his final breath, that patience and fairness could outlast even the cruelest aggression. She had also watched that same belief fail to save his life. She did not know, turning the question over long into the night, which side of that argument her husband himself would have landed on, faced with an invasion rather than merely a vote, and she suspected, sadly, that she would never know for certain. She did not share these private doubts with Jack before he left. She had decided, weeks before, that her son needed a steady mother behind him far more than he needed one more voice, arguing about a decision he had already earned the right to make for himself. But she carried the doubt anyway, quietly, the way she suspected a great many people across Earth were carrying some version of the same doubt, underneath all the flags and coalition ceremonies and hopeful news broadcasts. Elder Sora traveled to Earth herself not long after, the first time in the history of human and alien contact that a sitting council elder had set foot on the planet, rather than simply exchanging messages across the distance. She met with Admiral Rios and the Unity Council in person, in a plain government building not far from the green square where Thomas had been laid to rest, and before any formal business began, she asked to be taken there first. She stood before the simple stone marker bearing Thomas Hale's name for a long while, saying nothing, and when she finally turned back to Rios, her ancient eyes were steady but unmistakably wet. "I have outlived a great many friends, Admiral," Sora said. "It does not become easier with practice, whatever the young sometimes assume about age. I came to Earth today to sign your alliance in person, not because a signature requires my presence, but because I believe some debts are owed in person, or not truly owed at all." "You don't owe us anything, Elder," Rios said. "Your people have already given us 30 warships and technology we could not have built alone in 20 years. "I owe your ambassador a promise," Sora said. "He once told me that he did not want the Threll's friendship because we were strong and could protect Earth. He wanted it because he believed, given enough time, Earth could stand beside us as an equal, needing no protection at all. I intend to see that belief proven true, Admiral, whatever it costs the Threll to help prove it." The formal alliance was signed later that same afternoon. 30 Threll warships placed under joint command, with Earth's own rapidly growing fleet. The first true military alliance in the short history of human contact with the wider galaxy. In the weeks that followed, 4 smaller member species, moved by Sora's example and by the widespread broadcast of Ambassador Hale's final words, pledged supply ships, medical support, and in 2 cases, small squadrons of their own fighters, until the coalition gathering at Earth's shipyards had become something genuinely unprecedented. A fleet built not from a single empire's ambition, but from a dozen worlds' shared decision that fairness was worth defending together, or not defended at all. Jack Hale had spent those 6 months exactly the way he had promised Admiral Rios he would. He trained before dawn and after dusk, in the cockpit simulators and on the same obstacle course where his father had once given him an old pocket watch on the worst afternoon of his life. He learned to fly the new fighter craft the Threll had helped design, faster and far better armed than anything Earth's shipyards had ever produced on their own, and he learned, slowly and with more difficulty than the flying itself, to hold his own temper steady in simulated combat, the way his father had always asked him to. Alex Cole trained beside him through all of it, the two of them competing and pushing each other in the easy, familiar way of old friends, until by the 4th month Rios had begun pairing them together deliberately in every drill, because their instincts, she said, complemented each other in a way she rarely saw among cadets. "You fly like you're trying to prove something," Alex told him one evening, both of them exhausted and sweating after a brutal simulated dogfight that Jack had won by the narrowest possible margin. "I fly because it's fun. Between the two of us, we might actually make a decent team. Somebody has to keep me from getting us both killed doing something reckless," Jack said. "That job's usually mine," Alex said, grinning. Feels strange, doing it in reverse. Not every month went as smoothly as that easy banter suggested. In the third month, during a simulated combat exercise designed to test pilots under deliberately unfair conditions, Jack's squadron was ambushed by simulated enemy fighters, using tactics the instructors said the Vex Empire favored: feints, false retreats, strikes aimed at support ships rather than armed ones. Jack watched, in the simulation, a support vessel go down that he had failed to protect quickly enough, and something in him snapped. He broke formation and chased the simulated attacker far outside the group, breaking every rule of squadron discipline Rios had spent months drilling into him, until his own fighter was destroyed in turn, deep in enemy territory, alone. Rios pulled him out of the debrief in front of the entire squadron, which she rarely did. "You just got yourself and everyone counting on you killed," she said, her voice flat and cold in a way Jack had not heard from her before. "Not because you were outflown, because you got angry. And angry pilots do not think about formation, or fuel, or the 4 other people depending on them to hold position. Your father spent his whole career proving that anger is not the same thing as strength. I would hate to see his son prove the opposite, in a simulator, before the real thing has even started." Jack did not answer, because there was no answer that would not have sounded like an excuse, and excuses were exactly what Rios had no patience for. He went back to the simulator that same night, alone, and ran the same scenario 11 more times, forcing himself, again and again, to hold formation and trust his squadron, even when every instinct screamed at him to break away and chase the thing that had hurt them. By the 11th attempt he held the line, and the support vessel survived, and Jack sat alone in the powered-down simulator afterward for a long time, turning his father's pocket watch over in his hands, before he trusted himself enough to go to sleep. Alex found him there near dawn, still turning the watch over in his hands, and said nothing about the failed exercise at all, only sat down beside him on the simulator deck and waited, the way a good friend does, until Jack was ready to talk, or ready simply to go get breakfast, whichever came first. He never lost his temper in a simulation again, though it cost him, every single time, more effort than anyone watching him fly ever fully realized. By the 5th month, Rios called Jack into her office again, and this time she did not make him wait 15 minutes for an answer. "You have earned the assignment you asked me for 6 months ago," she told him. "You will serve as a squadron pilot aboard the Defiant, one of the new warships built with Threll assistance, under Captain Marisol Reyes. Cole will serve alongside you, and you will have a liaison officer assigned to your squadron directly, since the Defiant will be carrying a mixed human and Threll crew for the first time in Earth's history." The liaison officer, a young Threll named Vel, met Jack for the first time 2 days later on the training deck, and Jack found himself faintly surprised by how young Vel seemed, despite standing a full head taller than any human aboard, his sky-blue skin still carrying the faint mottled pattern the Threll considered a mark of youth rather than age. "I have studied human customs for 3 years, in preparation for exactly this kind of assignment," Vel said, with the careful formality Jack had come to recognize among younger Threll still eager to prove themselves. "I am told it is customary among human pilots to shake hands upon first meeting." "It is," Jack said, and shook the offered hand, finding Vel's grip firmer than he expected. "Welcome aboard, Vel. Fair warning, Alex over there is going to make fun of your accent within the hour." "I look forward to it," Vel said, with such genuine sincerity that Jack could not help but laugh, the first real laugh he had allowed himself in, longer than he cared to admit. Over the following weeks, Jack found himself genuinely glad of Vel's presence aboard the Defiant, in a way he had not expected from a liaison officer, assigned mostly to help with translation and protocol. Vel asked careful, earnest questions about human customs that often made Alex laugh outright, and answered questions about Threll life with the same careful earnestness, never once treating any question as foolish. "Why did you volunteer for this posting?" Jack asked him one evening, the two of them alone in the ready room while Alex ran late maintenance checks on their fighters. "Most Threll your age are still finishing basic diplomatic training. From what I understand, this isn't exactly a safe first assignment." Vel considered the question with his usual careful seriousness before answering. "My grandmother served on Concord Station's medical staff, many years ago, during the final battles of the Long War. She often told me that peace, is not something that simply happens to a galaxy. It is something a great many ordinary people choose, again and again, often at real cost to themselves. When your ambassador died still choosing peace, even as he was dying, I found I wanted very much to be part of whatever came after that choice, rather than simply reading about it from a safe distance. That's a heavier answer than I expected, Jack admitted. You asked a heavy question, Vel said, with the ghost of a smile Jack had learned, over the weeks, to recognize on his otherwise formal face. I am told humans sometimes ask questions they do not expect an honest answer to. I have decided I would rather always give one anyway. My father used to say patience outlasts anger, every single time, Jack said quietly, after a moment. I've been trying to actually believe that, out here, rather than just repeating it like a habit. Your grandmother's answer sounds like the same idea, said a different way. Vel inclined his head slightly, a gesture Jack now recognized as thoughtful agreement rather than simple politeness. Perhaps peace and patience are always the same idea, in every language that has ever tried to name it. By the time the Defiant squadron was fully assembled, it numbered 6 pilots in total, besides Jack, Alex, and Vel, who flew a support and communications role rather than a fighter craft himself. The squadron included Petra Lindquist, a quiet, precise pilot recruited from Earth's old orbital patrol service, who rarely spoke more than she had to, but flew with a discipline that even Rios praised without reservation. Desmond Cho, barely 20 years old, the youngest pilot in the entire fleet, whose easy, nervous energy reminded Jack faintly of himself at that age, before grief had settled into something quieter and more permanent. And Naomi Adeyemi, a former commercial shuttle pilot, who had switched to military service the week after Ambassador Hale's funeral, along with several thousand other new recruits across the planet. Feels strange, Naomi admitted one evening, over a shared meal in the mess hall, flying with people I might have delivered cargo to, a year ago, instead of training beside them for a war none of us ever expected to fight. Feels stranger still, Desmond said, that most of us signed up because of one man's funeral. I never even met Ambassador Hale. I just heard him die, on every screen in my apartment, and decided I couldn't keep watching the news after that without doing something. Jack said little during these conversations, mostly listening, though he found a certain comfort in it he had not expected. He was not the only person aboard the Defiant carrying his father's death as a private driving reason for being there. Petra rarely explained her own reasons for volunteering, and no one aboard pressed her to, though Jack noticed, more than once, that she kept a small folded photograph tucked into her flight jacket, in almost exactly the same place he kept his father's watch, and he found he understood enough, from that single detail alone, not to ask. That night, unable to sleep, Jack found himself thinking of a much older memory, one he had not returned to in years, though it surfaced now with startling clarity. He had been 11 years old, and he had come home from school with a split lip and a torn jacket, having gotten into a fight with an older boy who had said something cruel and untrue about his father's work, about how real men fought wars instead of talking their way around them. Jack had swung first and lost badly, and had expected, walking up the driveway that afternoon, that his father would be disappointed in him. Instead, Thomas had sat with him on the back porch, cleaning the cut on his lip with careful, gentle hands, and had not said a single word about the fight itself for a long while. Did it feel good? Thomas had finally asked, hitting him. Jack, 11 years old and still furious, had said yes, it had felt good, at least for the half-second before the other boy hit back twice as hard. I believe you, Thomas had said. Anger usually does feel good, for exactly that long. That's the trouble with it. It spends its whole reward up front, before you've even seen the bill. He had finished cleaning the cut, and sat back, looking at his son, with an expression Jack had not fully understood until many years later. You know what would have actually beaten that boy, Jack? Not your fists. The truth. He said something untrue about me, and the surest way to prove him wrong was never going to be a bloody lip. It was going to be growing up to be exactly the kind of man his lie said I couldn't raise. Patience does that. Anger never does. Patience outlasts anger, every single time, because anger burns hot and fast, and patience just keeps walking, long after anger has already used itself up. 11-year-old Jack had not understood most of that at the time, He mostly remembered being annoyed that his father would not simply agree the other boy deserved to be hit. 23-year-old Jack, lying awake in his bunk aboard a warship 6 months after burying his father, understood it completely, and found that understanding it did not make the anger any easier to carry. It only made him more determined to carry it the right way. Sarah Hale had known, from the moment Jack came home from his meeting with Admiral Rios with that particular look on his face, that this day would eventually arrive. Knowing it did not make it easier, the evening before the fleet was scheduled to depart, when Jack sat across the kitchen table from her, in his new dress uniform, looking so much like his father that it took her breath away for a moment before she could speak at all. "I already lost your father to this galaxy," Sarah said finally, her voice carefully even, the way she had learned to keep it even for Emily's sake over the past 6 months. "I understand why you're going, Jack. I even agree with why you're going. That doesn't make it easy to sit here and watch you leave for the same stars that took him." "I know," Jack said. "I wish I could tell you it wasn't going to be dangerous. I'm not going to lie to you, Mom. Not about this." "No," Sarah agreed. "Don't. Your father lied to me exactly once, at the shuttle port, when he said always, and both of us already half knew it might not be true. I would rather you just tell me you're afraid. If you are, then tell me everything is going to be fine." Jack was quiet for a moment. "I am afraid," he admitted. "Not of dying exactly. Of becoming someone Dad wouldn't recognize, out there. Of letting the anger win when it matters most." Sarah reached across the table and took her son's hand, the way she had once taken Emily's, the way Thomas used to hold her own face in both his hands. "Then don't let it. You have his patience in you, Jack, whether you always feel it or not. I've watched you carry that watch in your pocket for 6 months, like it might stop working if you set it down for even a moment. That's not nothing. That's exactly who your father raised you to be." Emily, 16 now, had been listening quietly from the doorway, and finally came and sat down beside her brother. "Bring it back," she said simply. "The watch. I want to see it again when this is over. Not just hear about it." "I promise," Jack said. And then, seeing the look that crossed both their faces at the word, added quickly, "I know. I know what that word is worth in this family lately. I'm going to try very hard to make it worth more, this time." 3 days before the fleet was scheduled to depart, intelligence gathered by a Threll scout ship, operating quietly along the border of Vex territory, confirmed something Admiral Rios had suspected but not been able to prove. Warlord Dren himself had moved his personal flagship, a massive vessel called the Ashkar's Pride, to the front of the invasion force massing at the edge of the Halden Reach. The scout mission itself had been a quiet, nerve-wracking affair, flown by a single Threll pilot named Orin, in a small, unarmed vessel built to look, to any casual sensor sweep, like an ordinary long-range survey craft. Orin had spent 6 days drifting at the very edge of detectable range, recording every ship that entered or left the growing Vex formation, and had come within a hair of discovery only once, when a Vex patrol altered course unexpectedly, and passed close enough that Orin later admitted, in her debrief, that she had shut down every non-essential system aboard, and simply waited, in the dark and the cold, to see whether she would be found. She had not been. The data she brought back 3 days later was the clearest picture the Council had yet obtained of exactly what waited at the edge of the Reach, nearly 200 Vex warships, and at the very center of the formation, unmistakable even at a distance, the distinctive silhouette of the Ashkar's Pride. 200 Vex warships against a coalition fleet of barely 150 was not, by any honest accounting, a fair fight, and Rios did not pretend otherwise to her assembled captains. But numbers alone, she reminded them, had not decided every battle in galactic history, and the Reach itself, with its scattered asteroid fields and narrow approach corridors, offered a defending fleet advantages that raw numbers could not simply overwhelm. "He isn't sending soldiers to do this work for him," Rios told her assembled captains, aboard the Valiant, the Joint Fleet's flagship, in the final briefing before departure. "He intends to take the Reach personally, in full view of every species watching, exactly as he took Ambassador Hale's life personally, 6 months ago. I do not believe that is an accident. I believe he wants this to be remembered as his victory, and his alone." Captain Reyes, A sharp-eyed woman with more real combat experience than almost anyone else in the newly built fleet, having served for years in older orbital defense patrols before the expansion, glanced toward the back of the briefing room where Jack stood among the other squadron pilots. Some of us have more personal reasons than others to make sure it isn't. I am aware of that, Rios said, her eyes finding Jack's briefly across the room. And I will say this once, to every pilot in this fleet, and I expect it to be the last time I need to say it. We are going to the Halden Reach to defend a council ruling and to protect worlds that cannot protect themselves. We are not going to settle a private grief. Any pilot who cannot tell the difference between those two things, under fire, is a danger to everyone flying beside them. I trust every one of you to remember which mission you signed on for. Jack held her gaze and nodded once, and meant it as fully as he had ever meant anything, though some small, honest part of him understood, standing there, that the two missions Rios had just described so carefully apart might not stay quite so separate once the shooting actually started. The morning of departure was clear and cold over the shipyards outside what had once been Cape Canaveral, now expanded into the largest orbital launch facility humanity had ever built. Sarah and Emily stood among a crowd of other families, watching the great new ships of the joint fleet rise slowly from their berths, human warships and Threll warships together for the first time in history, climbing toward orbit in a formation that would have seemed impossible only a year before. Nearby, Alex Cole said his own goodbyes to his father, a retired shuttle mechanic who had taught his son to fly in second-hand atmospheric trainers, years before Earth had ever dreamed of joining a wider galaxy. "Don't do anything I wouldn't do," his father told him, gripping his shoulder hard, and Alex laughed despite himself, because his father had spent 40 years flying every reckless maneuver a shuttle could survive, and the joke, worn smooth from repeating it at every departure since Alex's first training flight, still somehow worked exactly as it always had. Jack found his mother and sister in the crowd before boarding, and there were no long speeches left to give, after 6 months of preparing for exactly this morning. He hugged Emily first, and felt her hold on tighter and longer than her usual 16-year-old composure would normally allow. "Bring back the watch," she said again, into his shoulder. "I promise," Jack said, and this time the word came out steadier than it had at the kitchen table. He hugged his mother last, and she held his face in both her hands, the exact gesture she had used on his father so many times before, and Jack understood, in that moment, exactly how much of his family's love had always been carried in small repeated gestures rather than grand words. "Come home to us," Sarah said, and Jack heard, in the words themselves, the echo of every time she had said them to his father, and understood the terrible weight she was carrying, saying them now to her son instead. "I will," Jack said. "I promise you both." "Not always, I promise." He turned once more before walking toward the boarding gate, and saw his mother and sister standing exactly where his father must have once left them standing, at this same kind of goodbye, though on a much smaller and far less uncertain kind of ship. He found he could not decide, walking away from them, whether that thought made the moment easier to bear or harder, and settled, in the end, for simply not deciding, and walking forward anyway, because forward was the only direction left that still made any sense. He boarded the Defiant an hour later, found Alex and Vel already waiting for him near the squadron ready room, and felt, walking up the boarding ramp with his father's pocket watch heavy in his breast pocket, the strange dual weight of grief and purpose that had defined every single day of the past 6 months, now finally about to be tested against something larger than any simulator could ever have prepared him for. Behind him, Earth fell away into the black, smaller and more fragile-looking than he had ever noticed it being before, and ahead of him, somewhere past the edge of known space, a warlord who believed he had already won, waited at the front of his own fleet, with no idea that the son of the man he had killed was now flying directly toward him. The journey to the Halden Reach took 11 days, and for most of those 11 days, the greatest enemy aboard the Defiant was not the Vex Empire at all. It was waiting. Jack had imagined, in the months of training leading up to departure, that a fleet sailing toward war would feel different from ordinary life, charged with some constant, humming tension. Instead, he found that most of the 11 days felt almost startlingly normal. Meals were served on schedule in the mess hall, Maintenance crews ran their checks. Alex told the same 3 jokes he had been telling since flight school, and somehow still got a laugh out of Vel every single time, though Jack suspected by day 6 that Vel was laughing more out of loyalty than genuine surprise. "You're thinking too hard again," Alex said, on the 4th night, finding Jack in the observation deck, staring out at the long, unbroken field of stars. "I can always tell. You get this look, like you're trying to solve a math problem nobody's given you yet." "Just thinking about what's waiting for us," Jack admitted. "Rio said it herself. 200 ships against 150. Bad math, any way you do it." Alex leaned against the viewport beside him. "You know what my dad used to tell me, before every flight when I was learning? He said worrying about a landing you haven't reached yet just makes you a worse pilot for the miles in between. Whatever's waiting at the reach will still be waiting whether you spend the next 7 days dreading it or not. Might as well eat dinner and let Vel win at cards for once. Boosts morale." "I have not once let him win," Vel said, appearing in the doorway with the mild, injured dignity Jack had come to find genuinely funny. "I have won 4 consecutive games through skill alone, and I would appreciate it if the historical record reflected that accurately." Jack laughed, despite himself, and found that Alex had been right about at least one thing. Laughing helped more than staring at the stars ever did. Still, beneath the ordinary rhythm of shipboard life, Jack noticed the small signs of a crew quietly preparing itself for something none of them had truly done before. Petra ran extra maintenance checks on her fighter, long after regulations required it, her hands moving over the same panels again and again, in a way that looked less like caution and more like prayer. Desmond wrote letters he did not send, tucking them into a drawer beside his bunk, the way Jack had once seen his own father tuck unsent drafts of speeches into a desk. Naomi requested, twice, to review emergency evacuation procedures for civilian transports, a strange thing for a fighter pilot to focus on, until Jack remembered she had spent years flying commercial shuttles full of ordinary passengers before the war, and understood that some instincts simply never fully retire. On the 5th night of the journey, a data packet arrived from Earth, delayed by the usual lag of deep space relay, carrying a short recorded message from Emily. Jack watched it alone in his bunk, glad of the privacy. Emily looked a little older on the screen than she had at the shuttle port, though it had only been a few weeks. "Hi," she said, a bit awkwardly, clearly unused to recording herself for a device, rather than talking to an actual person. "Mom said I should send something, so you're not just staring at empty space for 11 days straight. I don't really know what to say. I started a project at school, actually, about Dad. Not for a grade, just for me. I've been going through his old files, the ones he kept from before he was ambassador, back when nobody at the UN paid attention to him. There's so much in there, Jack. Drafts of speeches he gave to almost nobody, notes about fairness and treaties that never happened, years before any of this. I don't think he ever stopped believing in the same things, even when nobody was watching. I just wanted you to know that, out there. I think it might matter to you more than it matters to me, actually, since you're the one about to." She trailed off, then straightened, visibly composing herself the way her mother did. "Anyway, come home. Bring the watch. I mean it, Jack." Jack watched the recording twice, then a third time, and found that Emily's small, halting message did something for him that none of Alex's easy jokes or Vel's careful philosophy quite managed. It reminded him, simply and directly, of exactly what he was flying 11 days through empty space to protect. Not an abstract idea of fairness, but an actual 16-year-old girl going through her dead father's old files late at night because she missed him too much to stop. He recorded a message back the following morning, keeping his own voice as steady as he could manage. "Tell Mom I'm eating enough, and tell her Alex is teaching Vel how to lose gracefully at cards, which is taking longer than expected. Keep the project going. I'd like to read it myself, when I'm home. I think Dad would like that you're the one finishing what he started, in your own way." He paused, then added, quietly, "I love you both. I'll see you soon." It would be 11 more days before Emily received it, by which point, though neither of them yet knew it, the first battle of the war would already be behind him. On the 7th day, the fleet's outer scouts detected a small Vex patrol, 4 ships, moving along the fringe of the reach, in a pattern that suggested reconnaissance rather than attack. Admiral Rios ordered 2 squadrons forward to intercept before the patrol could report the coalition fleet's exact numbers and position back to Dren. It was Jack's first real combat, and it did not feel the way any simulator had prepared him to expect. The Vex ships broke formation the moment they registered the coalition squadrons closing, 2 of them peeling off to run, while the other 2 turned to fight and buy time for their retreat, exactly the kind of feint the instructors had warned about. Jack's hands moved through the maneuvers his body now knew better than his mind did, weapons fire lighting the dark in bright, silent flashes that his mind, oddly, kept comparing to fireworks, before some more serious part of him corrected the comparison with a kind of quiet horror. He watched, in his targeting display, one of the fleeing Vex ships take a hit from Naomi's squadron and break apart in a burst of light that his display politely labeled, in small clinical text, as a confirmed kill. There were people inside that ship, Jack thought, and then made himself stop thinking it, because Rios's voice was in his ear, reminding the squadron to hold formation, and there was no time left for anything except flying. The skirmish lasted less than 4 minutes. 1 Vex ship was destroyed, 1 was disabled and later boarded, and 2 escaped toward the main formation, exactly as expected. No coalition ships were lost. It should have felt like a victory, and in the strictest sense, it was won. Jack did not feel like celebrating. He sat alone in the cockpit for a long while after landing, engine cooling around him, and found himself turning his father's pocket watch over and over in his gloved hand, though he could not have said, if asked, exactly what he was hoping the old worn silver case might tell him. Admiral Rios found him there an hour later, having noticed, in the way good commanders always seem to notice everything, that Jack had not yet reported to the debrief. "First kill sits differently than the simulator ever prepares you for," she said, without preamble, settling into the seat of the fighter beside his own. "I remember mine, 14 years ago, during a border skirmish nobody outside the fleet ever heard about. I did not sleep for 2 days afterward." "It doesn't feel like justice," Jack said quietly. "It doesn't feel like anything my father would have wanted either." "No," Rios agreed. "It rarely does, in the moment. That is not a flaw in you, Jack. That is the last honest part of a person, refusing to let violence feel comfortable, even when it is necessary. I would worry a great deal more about an officer who felt nothing at all today." She studied him for a moment. "Your father asked Earth not to let his death become only a wound to avenge. I have thought about that request more since we left Earth's orbit than at any point in the 6 months before it. I do not believe today's action dishonored it. We defended ourselves, and disabled rather than destroyed, where we had the choice to. But I will be watching closely, in the days ahead, for the moment that line starts to blur. I need you watching for it too, in yourself, most of all." "I will," Jack said, and meant it, though some quiet, honest part of him understood that promises made in a cooling cockpit an hour after a battle were easier to keep than promises tested in the middle of one. 4 days later, the coalition fleet crossed into the outer edge of the Halden Reach, and Jack, watching from the Defiant's forward viewport alongside Alex and Vel, understood for the first time exactly what all the fighting had actually been about. The Reach was beautiful in a way none of the briefing documents had prepared him for. A wide, scattered field of asteroids and broken planetoids, threaded through with faint, glowing veins of ether crystal, that caught the distant starlight and scattered it into soft blue light across the whole region, like a river of stars running through the dark. Small mining stations, most of them decades old, clung to the larger asteroids, their lights blinking steadily against the void, home to the Van engineers and various other species who had built quiet, unremarkable lives, extracting a resource that had somehow become worth an entire galaxy's attention. "It's smaller than I expected," Alex said quietly, "for something everyone's about to die over." "Most of the things people fight over turn out that way, I think," Vel said. "Land, resources, pride. It is rarely the size of the thing itself that matters. It is what it represents to the people willing to die for it." Jack said nothing, watching the slow drift of blue light across the asteroid fields, and thought of his father's speech in the council chamber, the one Jack had only ever heard secondhand, about how the Reach could lift a dozen small worlds out of poverty. It did not look, from here, like a battlefield. It looked like exactly what his father had always insisted it should be allowed to remain, an ordinary, quietly valuable place, worth protecting rather than conquering. The moment did not last long. Within the hour, the fleet learned that Dren had not waited for them. A small council monitoring outpost near the edge of the Reach, staffed by a handful of van engineers and 2 Threll technicians, had already come under attack by an advance Vex detachment 3 hours before the main coalition fleet arrived in range. Rios ordered an immediate response, splitting the fleet to both defend the outpost and screen against a possible ambush from the larger Vex formation, still gathering deeper in the Reach. The battle that followed was the largest Jack had ever been part of, and it did not resemble the earlier skirmish at all. Dozens of ships filled the space around the outpost, weapons fire crossing in bright, chaotic lines, and Jack found himself flying formation with Alex and Petra, while Vel coordinated communications, and Naomi and Desmond ran a separate pattern, meant to draw Vex fighters away from the outpost's remaining defenses. For the first several minutes, the battle went well. Jack and Alex worked through a tight, practiced pattern they had drilled 100 times in simulation, picking off 2 Vex fighters attempting to flank the outpost's northern approach, while Petra held a defensive line closer to the station itself, her precise, disciplined flying exactly as steady under real fire as it had always been in drills. Over the comm, Jack heard Naomi call out a successful intercept of her own, her voice tight with focused concentration rather than fear, and for a brief, dangerous moment, Jack allowed himself to think that perhaps the battle would go as cleanly as the simulators had always promised it eventually would. 2 more incoming, bearing from the asteroid field, Vel's voice came through the comm, steady despite the chaos around him. Configuration suggests a fast strike pattern, not a standard patrol. Copy that, Jack said, banking hard to intercept, Alex following a half-second behind, their instincts moving in the same practiced rhythm they had built over 6 months of training together. They caught the first fighter in a crossfire before it could reach the outpost's outer defenses, and Jack felt, for just a moment, something close to real confidence, the specific, dangerous confidence of a young pilot who has just begun to believe he understands the shape of the battle he is in. That confidence lasted perhaps 90 more seconds. It went wrong quickly, the way Rios had warned him real battles sometimes did, no matter how carefully they were planned. A group of Vex fighters, faster and more maneuverable than the ones in the earlier skirmish, broke through Naomi and Desmond's screening pattern and turned directly toward the fragile outpost itself. Jack heard Desmond's voice over the comm, tight with something between excitement and fear, calling that he was breaking off to cut them out before they reached firing range. Desmond, hold position. Let the outpost's own defenses. Rios's voice, sharp and urgent, cut through the channel, but the order came half a second too late. Jack watched, helpless, from 2 full kilometers away, as Desmond's fighter took a direct hit meant for the outpost, absorbing it fully, buying the 2 seconds the outpost's automated defenses needed to finish charging and drive the remaining Vex fighters back. Desmond Cho did not eject in time. For a moment, no one on the comm channel said anything at all. Then Petra's voice broke through, tight and urgent, breaking from her defensive position without waiting for orders. I can still reach him. I'm going. Lindquist, hold position. That is a direct order. Rios's voice, sharp with an urgency Jack had never heard from her before, cut across the channel, but Petra was already moving, her fighter breaking from the defensive line, toward the drifting wreckage of Desmond's ship, chasing some faint, desperate hope that the tactical display had already ruled out entirely. Jack watched her fighter's icon on his own display, moving fast and alone across open space, and opened his mouth to call out to her, though he could not, afterward, remember what he had actually meant to say. He never got the chance. A second wave of Vex fighters, pressing the advantage of the momentary gap in the coalition line, caught Petra's fighter in the open, and her icon on the display blinked out, second by terrible second, exactly the way Desmond's had only minutes before. The battle ended 20 minutes later, the outpost saved, the Vex detachment driven back deeper into the Reach, to await the arrival of Dren's main force. It was, by every strategic measure, Rios reported afterward, a successful defense. It cost the coalition 3 ships. One was a Threll support vessel, its entire crew lost, The other two were Desmond's and Petra's. Jack learned the full weight of it only after landing, standing in the hangar bay in his flight suit, still shaking slightly from adrenaline that had nowhere left to go, Alex told him, his own voice hollow with the particular shock of losing someone who had, only hours before, been trading quiet jokes over breakfast. It was Vel, going through Petra's personal effects with the careful, respectful formality of someone raised to honor the dead properly, who found the folded photograph she had always kept tucked into her flight jacket. It showed a small boy, perhaps 6 years old, grinning at the camera from the front seat of an old model shuttle, clearly delighted with himself. She never mentioned a son, Alex said quietly, looking at the photograph in Vel's hand. She mentioned very little about herself, ever, Vel said. I believe that was simply her way. Some grief is carried loudly, and some is carried in silence, and I do not think either way is wrong. Jack took the photograph gently and looked at the boy's bright, uncomplicated smile for a long moment before handing it back. He thought of his own mother and Emily waiting on Earth. He thought of a small boy somewhere on Earth right now, perhaps already being told, in some version of the same terrible middle-of-the-night phone call that had once found Sarah Hale, that his mother was not coming home. Something cold and hard settled into Jack's chest, sitting there in the hangar bay, and it took him a long moment of careful, deliberate effort, turning his father's watch over in his hand, to recognize the feeling for what it actually was, and to make himself set it down, rather than let it drive him. That night, Rios held a small memorial for Desmond and Petra and the lost Threll crew, aboard the Valiant, attended by as much of the fleet as could be spared from duty. She read both their names aloud, along with the names of the Threll crew, and said little else, because there was little else, she believed, that needed saying. Jack stood beside Alex and Vel throughout it, and found himself thinking, more than once, of his father's final words. Do not let my death become only a wound to avenge. He understood now, more fully than he ever had, aboard the safe distance of a training deck, exactly how difficult that request truly was to honor, standing in a room built to mourn two people who should have had 40 more years ahead of them. The disabled Vex fighter captured during the earlier patrol skirmish had been carrying a single surviving pilot, badly injured but alive, who was brought aboard the Valiant under guard and given medical treatment despite his own initial, furious insistence that he would rather die than accept aid from coalition hands. His name, according to the identification recovered from his ship, was Rack, a junior Vex officer, barely older than Jack himself. For the first 2 days of his recovery, he refused to speak to anyone beyond bare hostile silence, glaring at every human or Threll who entered his medical bay, with an expression that made his opinion of his captors entirely clear, without a single word being necessary. It was Vel, of all people, who finally got him talking, arriving one evening not to interrogate him, but simply to sit nearby and ask, with his usual careful earnestness, whether the Vex had any customs around long recoveries that the medical staff should be respecting. You ask that as though you care, Rock said, the first full sentence he had offered anyone since his capture. I do care, Vel said simply. I do not believe every Vex soldier chose this war personally, any more than every human chose it. I would like to treat you as a person rather than only as an enemy, if you will allow it. Rack studied him for a long moment, some of the hard suspicion in his face shifting, slightly, into something more tired. I was conscripted 8 months ago, from a mining colony on the outer edge of Vex territory. My family has worked that colony for 3 generations. We do not choose warlords. We are given quotas, and told which quotas we may refuse only at the cost of our colony's supply allocations. His voice hardened again, briefly. Do not mistake this for an apology. I still fought for my empire, and I would fight again tomorrow if given the chance. But do not imagine every ship in Dren's fleet is crewed by soldiers who believe in his cause the way he does. Over the following days, in careful, halting conversations, mostly conducted with Vel present and occasionally Jack, Rack revealed more than perhaps he had intended to. He spoke of growing discontent among the Empire's conscripted ranks, of officers like Kale who privately questioned Dren's ambitions but lacked the standing to oppose him openly, of a warlord who had grown so certain of his own destiny that he had begun ignoring even the counsel of his most senior advisors. He does not intend to stop at the Reach, Rock said. On the fourth day, his voice quieter than before, as though even saying it aloud troubled him. I overheard enough, before my ship was disabled, to know that much. The Reach is only the opening move. He believes that if the Coalition's fleet is broken here, decisively, in full view of the Council, no small species will ever again risk standing against Vec's ambition. And he has already selected his next target, to make certain the lesson is not forgotten. Which target? Jack asked, his chest tightening. Rock hesitated, then answered. The Van Homeworld. It lies less than 2 days from the Reach, and it has no fleet capable of defending itself. If Dren breaks the Coalition here, he intends to take Van Space next, as an example to the rest of the galaxy, of what resistance costs. Jack had visited the medical bay himself 2 days before this final admission, without quite deciding beforehand whether he intended to talk to Rack or simply needed somewhere to sit that was not haunted by an empty bunk and a folded photograph of a small boy in a shuttle seat. Rock had watched him enter with obvious wariness. Come to finish what your fighters started. No, Jack said, surprising himself with how steady his own voice came out. Came to see the person my father died trying to save, whether he knew it or not. Rock's expression had shifted, some of the guardedness giving way to genuine confusion. Your father? Ambassador Thomas Hale, Jack said, killed on Concord Station, 7 months ago, by mercenaries your warlord hired, and then denied hiring. You've probably heard the recording. Most of the galaxy has, by now. Something in Rack's face had changed, the hostility falling away for a moment, replaced by something more complicated. I heard it. We were not permitted to discuss it openly, among the ranks, but I heard it, the same as everyone did. My own mother wept when it played on the colony's public relay. She had never once cared about council politics before that day. He had studied Jack more carefully. I did not know he was your father. I do not know the correct thing to say, to the son of a man my empire murdered, while I sit here under his son's guard. There isn't a correct thing to say, Jack had admitted. I've been trying to figure that out myself for 7 months. 2 days ago I lost 2 people from my own squadron, a friend who told bad jokes and made you laugh at them anyway, a woman who kept a photograph of her son in her jacket, and never told anyone she had one. I could hate you very easily right now, Rock. Some part of me wants to. It would honestly be simpler. Why don't you then? Jack had turned the pocket watch over once in his hand before answering. Because my father spent his whole life trying to prove that fairness mattered more than being right about who deserved blame. And because you told Vel you were conscripted. Given a quota you couldn't refuse without costing your family everything. That doesn't sound like an enemy to me. It sounds like someone caught in the same machine that's grinding up my own people, just from a different side of it. Rack had been quiet for a long moment. Your empire is very young, to already understand something my own has forgotten for generations. We're not an empire, Jack had said. We're barely a fleet. Maybe that's exactly why we can still afford to remember it. He had left shortly after, without any real resolution between them, though something had shifted, quietly, in the small medical bay that day. It was not forgiveness, not from either of them. But it was, perhaps, the beginning of the same difficult thing his father had spent his entire life trying to build among people who had far less reason than Jack did to extend it. The stubborn choice to see another person clearly, rather than only through the shape of what he had lost. It was, Jack suspected, at least part of why Rack had finally chosen, 2 days later, to tell him and Vel the truth about Van Space, rather than continuing to hold it back. The news reached Admiral Rios within the hour, and she called an emergency strategy session aboard the Valiant that same evening, attended by every captain in the Coalition fleet, along with Elder Sora, who had traveled with the fleet as the Council's official liaison, and Rack himself, brought in under guard but treated, at Vel's quiet insistence, with basic dignity, rather than as a mere prisoner, to be discarded once useful. If Rack's information is accurate, Rios told the assembled captains, we no longer have the luxury of a slow, cautious defense of the Reach. Dren intends to use this battle to break our resolve entirely, and then move immediately against a member world with no meaningful defense of its own. We must assume he will press the attack here soon, likely within days, expecting either a quick victory or a costly enough fight to leave us too weakened to defend Van Space afterward. Captain Reyes leaned forward, her expression grim. Then, we cannot afford a battle of attrition here. If we bleed ourselves defending the Reach, and have nothing left to send to Van Space afterward, Dren wins regardless of who holds the Reach itself when the fighting ends. The Van delegate who had spoken so plainly before the council months earlier was not present in the room, but her words seemed to hang over the discussion regardless. Somewhere less than 2 days from where the fleet now sat, on a small world none of the assembled captains had ever visited, ordinary Van families were almost certainly going about ordinary evenings, entirely unaware that a warlord they had never met had already chosen their homes as a lesson for the rest of the galaxy. Jack, standing near the back of the room beside Vel, found himself thinking of Emily's recorded message, of a small boy in a photograph he would never get to grow up properly, and understood, with sudden and total clarity, exactly why Rios's plan could not be allowed to fail for lack of boldness. A younger captain named Priyanka Basu, commanding one of the smaller Threll-built support cruisers, raised a cautious hand. "Admiral, with respect, dividing our fleet before the main engagement even begins feels like exactly the kind of risk Dren would want us to take. What if the attack on the Reach is the true target, and Van Space is only a threat meant to split our forces and weaken us here?" "That is a fair concern," Rios said, "and I do not dismiss it lightly. But Rocket's account matches independent patterns our own scouts have already observed. Supply movements, fuel reserves, troop rotations, all consistent with a force intending to press onward, rather than settle for a single prize. I would rather risk dividing our strength against a real second target than gamble every ship we have on the hope that a man like Dren intends to stop at only one conquest, when nothing in his history suggests he ever has." "I am aware of that," Rios said, "which is why I intend to split our strategy. We will hold the Reach with a defensive formation strong enough to make Dren's victory here costly, while positioning a secondary force to move to Van Space, the moment his intentions become clear, rather than waiting for an official request that may arrive too late to matter." She looked around the room at the gathered captains, her expression steady despite the enormity of what she was proposing. "This is a considerable risk. If I am wrong about his timing, we may find our forces divided at exactly the wrong moment. I would welcome any officer's honest doubts before I commit this fleet to a plan that cannot easily be undone once begun." Elder Sora rose slowly. "I have watched this warlord's patterns for longer than most in this room have been alive. I do not believe you are wrong, Admiral. I believe, if anything, you may be running out of time faster than even Rakkus information suggests." The room was quiet for a long moment. Then, one by one, the captains voted to approve the plan, and the fleet began, immediately, the careful, exhausting work of preparing for a battle that would need to be fought on 2 fronts at once, against an enemy who believed, with the calm certainty of a man who had never truly been made to answer for anything, that he had already won. The night before the main Vex assault on the Reach was expected to begin, Jack found himself unable to sleep, and made his way instead to the small chapel room aboard the Defiant, a quiet space set aside for whatever quiet reflection different crew members needed, human or Threll alike. Alex and Vel were already there when he arrived, along with Naomi, the 4 of them sitting together in the dim, comfortable silence of people who had already said most of what needed saying about the 2 friends they had buried 3 days earlier. "You keep touching that watch," Alex said quietly, nodding at Jack's hand, which had, without his quite noticing, found its way to his jacket pocket again. "My father gave it to me the day he left for Concord Station," Jack said. "The last time I saw him before." He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. He took the watch out and turned it over once in his palm, and then, without quite planning to, played the recording of his father's final message on his personal comm device. The same recording he had listened to alone more times than he could count over the past 7 months, though he had never once played it for anyone else. The small room was silent as Thomas Hale's tired, steady voice filled it once more. "Do not let my death become only a wound to avenge. Let it become a reason to stand taller, to demand fairness louder, and to never mistake cruelty for strength." When it finished, no one spoke for a long moment. "He sounds like he was a good man," Naomi said finally quietly. "I never got to meet him. I only ever heard this recording, same as most of Earth. But I think about those words more than almost anything else, some days." He was the best man I ever knew, Jack said. I am trying very hard, out here, to be even half of that. Some days it feels like the only real mission I actually signed up for, and everything else is just what got me close enough to attempt it. Vel studied him for a moment with his usual careful thoughtfulness. Tomorrow will test that mission more than anything you have faced so far. I do not say that to frighten you. I say it because I believe you will need to remember it clearly, in the middle of whatever comes. The chapel door opened quietly, and Admiral Rio stepped in, looking, for perhaps the first time since Jack had known her, less like a commanding officer, and more like a woman who had also buried people she cared about that week. She did not sit, only stood near the doorway for a moment, as though deciding whether she belonged in the room at all. I don't often do this, she admitted. Visit the night before. I find it easier most times to keep some distance between myself and the pilots I'm about to send into danger. But Desmond and Petra were under my command, and I find I did not want to spend tonight alone with that, if I could help it. You're welcome here, Admiral, Naomi said quietly, and meant it, and Rios, after a moment, sat. They stayed together a while longer, 5 people from 2 different worlds, saying little, needing little more than the quiet company of others, who understood exactly what the coming morning would ask of them. When Rios finally rose to leave, she paused at the door and looked back at Jack. Your father once told me that Earth's future depended on becoming strong without becoming cruel, she said. I did not fully believe him, the day he said it. I believe him more with every month that passes. Fly well tomorrow, Lieutenant Hale. Fly like a man trying to prove his father right, not like a man trying to make Dren pay. I have found, in 30 years of service, that only one of those 2 men ever comes home in one piece. I know, Jack said. He closed his hand around the watch. Patience outlasts anger, every single time. I intend to prove my father right tomorrow, one way or another. Outside the small chapel's single viewport, the Halden Reach's scattered asteroid fields drifted past in the dark, indifferent and ancient, entirely unaware that somewhere among them, in only a few hours' time, the largest battle in the short history of human contact with the wider galaxy was about to begin. The Vex invasion force struck at first light, if light was even the right word for the pale, distant starlight that passed for morning in the Halden Reach. Jack had expected, after everything Rios's briefings had prepared him for, that he would feel something like fear when the moment finally arrived. Instead, strapped into the Defiance launch bay beside Alex, watching the sensor display fill with the blinking red icons of nearly 200 Vex warships breaking from formation and surging toward the Coalition line, he felt something quieter and stranger, a kind of terrible clarity, as though every simulation, every drill, every night spent turning his father's watch over in his hands, had all been building toward exactly this one morning, and there was nothing left to do now except find out whether any of it had actually worked. Squadrons, launch. Captain Reyes's voice came over the comm, steady and clipped. Hold the asteroid corridors. Force them to come at us in narrow lines. Do not, under any circumstances, chase a retreating target into open space. Jack's fighter cleared the launch bay a half-second after Alex's, and the Battle of the Halden Reach began in earnest. It was, from the very first moment, unlike anything the earlier skirmishes had prepared him for. The Coalition fleet held its position among the scattered asteroid fields exactly as Rios had planned, using the Reach's own broken terrain to break up the Vex Empire's numerical advantage, forcing Dren's ships to funnel through narrow corridors of rock and debris, where their sheer numbers could not be brought fully to bear all at once. Jack flew formation with Alex and Naomi and Vel's careful communications support, weaving between drifting asteroids at speeds that would have seemed suicidal in any simulator, trading fire with Vex fighters in engagements that lasted seconds rather than minutes, each one ending in either a confirmed kill or a narrow, breathless escape. Twice in the first hour alone, Jack felt the particular cold drop in his stomach that came from a shot missing him by less distance than he cared to measure. Once when a Vex fighter he had thought disabled fired a last, desperate volley as it tumbled past him, and once when a piece of drifting wreckage nearly took his wing clean off before he wrenched the fighter sideways at the very last possible moment. Each time he found his hands steadier than his racing heart had any right to expect, muscle memory built over 7 months of drills carrying him through, the instant before conscious thought could catch up. You still with me? Alex's voice came over the comm, tight with the particular urgency of a friend who had just watched something nearly go very wrong. Still here, Jack said. Eyes forward. We've got 3 more inbound on your marker. They broke together toward the new threat, and for a while there was no room in Jack's mind for anything except the immediate, consuming work of staying alive and keeping his squadron alive alongside him. The old anger and grief that had driven him here for months folded, for now, into something more useful, pure, focused attention. Left flank is holding, Vel reported, after nearly an hour of continuous engagement, his voice steady, despite the visible strain in it. Right flank reports moderate losses, but the line remains unbroken. And the Ashkar's pride? Jack asked, between maneuvers. Holding position at the center of the Vex formation, directing the assault personally, Vel said, exactly as Rock predicted. Jack thought, briefly, of the man he had spoken with in the medical bay only days before, and found himself grateful, in the strange, clipped way combat allowed for gratitude, that Rock's information had held true so far. The battle's turning point came nearly 3 hours in, when Captain Reyes received an urgent transmission from Admiral Rios's flagship. Rakek's information about the Ashkar's Pride's shield configuration has been confirmed by our own sensor data, Rios told her assembled captains, her voice carrying the particular tightness of someone who had found an opportunity too valuable to ignore, but too risky to take lightly. The flagship's forward shields draw power from a secondary relay, whenever Dren personally directs a full formation strike, exactly as he is doing now. For a window of perhaps 90 seconds, the flagship's aft shields will be operating at reduced capacity. It is not a large window, and I will not pretend this is anything but a considerable risk. But if a fast, well-piloted vessel can reach the flagship's aft docking section during that window, a boarding party could get aboard. Captain Reyes met Rios's gaze across the comm channel, both women understanding immediately the size of what was being proposed. You're suggesting we try to take the flagship directly, capture or kill the warlord himself, in the middle of an active battle. I am suggesting it is possible, Rios said carefully. I will not order any captain to attempt it. The risk to any boarding party would be extreme, and I do not know that it would meaningfully shorten the battle, even if it succeeded. But if Dren falls, or is captured, I believe there is a real chance his fleet's morale collapses along with him. Every account we have of the Vex Empire's inner politics, including Rax, suggests his authority rests far more on personal fear and personal victory than on any loyalty his officers feel toward the Empire itself. Jack, listening on the squadron channel, felt something in his chest go very still and very clear. Captain, he said, before he had fully decided to speak at all. The Defiant is fast enough to make that approach. I can lead a boarding team. There was a pause on the channel long enough that Jack wondered if he had spoken out of turn. Captain Reyes glanced first at her own tactical officer, a quiet exchange Jack could not hear, before she answered. Lieutenant Hale, Rios said finally, her voice quieter than before. I want to be very certain of something before I even consider this proposal. If you board that ship, and you find yourself standing in front of the man who ordered your father's death, I need to know, with total certainty, which mission you will be carrying out, the one your father asked for, or the one your anger wants. Jack closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the familiar weight of the watch in his breast pocket. My father's mission, Admiral, I give you my word. Another pause, shorter this time. Captain Reyes, the decision is yours to make. As commanding officer of the Defiant, I will support whatever you decide. Reyes was quiet for a moment, studying Jack through the comm display with the sharp, assessing look of a woman who had spent years learning to read pilots under pressure. Assemble your team, Lieutenant. You have 4 minutes before the window opens. Choose carefully who you bring. Jack chose Alex and Vel without hesitation, and 2 of the Defiant's Marine security officers, Sergeant Okonkwo and Corporal Reyna, both of whom had trained extensively for exactly this kind of boarding action, though neither had ever expected to actually carry it out against a warlord's own flagship. You understand the odds here, Sergeant Okonkwo said, checking his weapon with brisk, professional efficiency, as the small boarding shuttle prepared to launch. 5 of us, against however many guards a warlord keeps on his own bridge. I understand them, Jack said. "I also understand what happens to the Van homeworld if this battle doesn't end soon enough. I'll take the odds." The shuttle launched into the chaos of the ongoing battle, weaving between drifting wreckage and crossing weapons fire. Naomi and two other fighters running dangerous, close escort to cover its approach. Jack watched, through the shuttle's small viewport, as the Ashkar's pride grew from a distant silhouette into an enormous, looming wall of dark metal, and felt his own heartbeat, for the first time all day, become something he had to consciously work to steady. Halfway through the approach, a pair of Vex interceptors broke from the flagship's own escort screen and turned toward the shuttle, and for a long, breathless handful of seconds, it seemed entirely possible that the mission would end there, in open space, before it had even properly begun. Naomi's voice cut across the calm in the particular way pilots learned to be calm precisely when calm was hardest to manage. "I have them. Hold your course." She and her wingman broke off to intercept, and Jack watched through the viewport as Naomi's fighter rolled hard beneath the lead interceptor's fire and put two clean shots through its engine housing, the second Vex fighter peeling away rather than face the same fate alone. It was, Jack thought, exactly the kind of flying his father would have called controlled, rather than clever. The difference, Thomas had always said, between a pilot who survived and one who merely got lucky. 30 seconds to the shield window, Vel reported, monitoring the sensor feed relayed from the Defiant. "Approach vector is clean. Naomi's escort has cleared two fighters attempting to intercept." The shuttle struck the flagship's aft docking section with a hard, grinding impact that rattled every one of them in their harnesses, and Sergeant Okonkwo had the emergency airlock cutting tool deployed before the shuttle had even fully stopped moving. "We're in," he announced 30 seconds later, as the outer airlock hissed open. "Move fast. That shield window isn't staying open forever, and neither is our exit." The corridors of the Ashkar's Pride were narrower and darker than Jack had expected, lit by a dim, reddish light that seemed designed more to intimidate than to illuminate. The first Vex guards they encountered, caught entirely off guard by an attack from inside their own ship during the height of a battle they believed was going their way, fell quickly to Okonkwo and Reyna's disciplined, efficient fire. It was in the ship's second main corridor that things went wrong. A larger contingent of Vex soldiers, alerted by the earlier exchange, met them at a junction with far more organized resistance, and in the chaos of the firefight that followed, Jack lost sight of Vel for several agonizing seconds, hearing only static and shouting over the comm before he caught sight of his friend again, pinned down behind a support strut, cut off from the rest of the group by a wall of weapons fire. Every instinct Jack had told him to press forward toward the bridge, toward Dren, toward the confrontation that had been building in him for 7 months. He looked instead at Vel, pinned and exposed, and made the only choice his father's lessons had ever truly prepared him to make. "Alex, cover me," Jack said, and broke from the group, sprinting low across the exposed junction toward Vel's position, drawing fire that gave Reyna the opening she needed to flank the Vex soldiers from the side. He reached Vel just as a shot meant for his friend's exposed shoulder came close enough that Jack felt the heat of it pass his own arm, and hauled Vel bodily back behind the support strut, both of them breathing hard. "You should not have done that," Vel said between breaths, though something in his voice suggested he was glad, regardless, that Jack had. "The mission required you to reach the bridge, not to risk yourself rescuing a liaison officer." "The mission also required me to remember which one I was actually on," Jack said. "Come on, we're not leaving anyone behind on this ship." They pushed forward together, and within another few minutes of hard, close fighting, the corridor was clear, and the path to the bridge lay open ahead of them. Near the final junction before the bridge, they came upon a single young Vex soldier who had taken cover behind a bulkhead rather than retreat with the rest of his unit, his weapon raised but his hands, Jack could see even at a distance, trembling badly enough to throw off any aim he might have had. He could not have been much older than Desmond had been. "Don't," Jack said, lowering his own weapon fractionally, close enough now to see the young soldier's face clearly through his helmet's open visor. "You don't have to die defending a man who'll be on trial in front of the whole galaxy within the week. Put it down." For a long moment, nobody on either side moved. Then the young soldier's weapon clattered to the deck, and he raised both hands, something that looked very much like relief passing over his face before he could stop it. "Reyna, get him somewhere safe and out of the fighting," Jack said. "He's not our enemy today. He's just someone else's soldier." They left the young Vex conscript under Reyna's brief guard and pressed on, and Jack found himself thinking, as they approached the bridge doors, of Rack in the medical bay, and of how many soldiers on both sides of this war, he suspected, had never actually chosen it at all. The bridge of the Ashkar's Pride was larger than Jack had expected, ringed with view screens showing the raging battle outside, and at its center, exactly as Jack had known he would be, stood Warlord Dren, his bronze armor catching the reddish light, his expression, as he turned to face the intruders who had somehow fought their way onto his own command deck, one of genuine and total surprise. "Impossible," Dren said, and for just a moment, the calm certainty that had defined every account Jack had ever heard of him cracked slightly at the edges. "You should have expected it," Jack said, stepping forward, his weapon raised, Alex and Vel moving to cover the bridge's other exits behind him. "My father spent his whole career proving that people you underestimate have a way of becoming the thing that finally stops you." Dren's guards moved to defend him, and a brief, sharp exchange of fire left two of them disabled before the rest, seeing their warlord's own bridge crew fall so quickly, held back, uncertain, waiting for an order Dren seemed momentarily unable to give. "Ambassador Hale's son," Dren said finally, studying Jack with something between contempt and genuine curiosity. "I confess, I did not think the council would send a grieving child to settle a diplomatic matter with a gun." "This isn't diplomacy," Jack said. "This is what happens when diplomacy fails, because someone decided fairness was only worth respecting when it was convenient. You had a vote, you lost it. Instead of accepting that, you murdered a man for asking a galaxy to be fair, and then you came here to take by force what you couldn't win by argument." "Your father was a fool," Dren said, and something genuinely cold entered his voice for the first time. He believed a soft word could hold back an empire built on strength. He was wrong, and his death proved it. Nothing that has happened since has changed that fact. You are standing on my bridge with a weapon in your hand, exactly as I always said the galaxy actually worked, whatever pretty words your council prefers to use instead." "You're wrong," Jack said, though something in his chest was shaking now, hot and dangerous, exactly the feeling his father had once described on a back porch a lifetime ago. Anger usually does feel good, for exactly that long. My father's words reached every species in this galaxy. They built an alliance you said could never exist. They brought me here, to your own bridge, with soldiers from 3 different worlds standing beside me. That isn't weakness proving itself wrong, Dren. That's exactly what he said would happen, if people chose patience over cruelty. You just lived long enough to watch it happen to you personally." For a long moment, the bridge was silent except for the distant, muffled sounds of battle beyond its walls. Behind him, Jack heard Alex shift his footing slightly, close enough to speak without being overheard by anyone but him. "Whatever you decide, Jack, I've got your back either way. But for what it's worth, I don't think your father raised the kind of son who needs to prove anything to a man like this." "Finish it then," Dren said quietly, straightening, his voice suddenly and strangely calm. "Isn't that why you came? Not to arrest me, not to recite council law at me, to put a weapon in my chest and call it justice, the same as I called your father's death a necessary cost. Go on, ambassador's son. Prove that you are exactly what you claim you are not." Jack's finger tightened, almost of its own accord, against the trigger, and for one long, terrible second, he understood with total clarity exactly how easy it would be. One motion, one breath, 7 months of grief settled, all at once, in a single decision that no one aboard this bridge would ever question. He thought of his father's voice, tired and steady, recorded in the last minutes of his life. "Do not let my death become only a wound to avenge." He thought of Rios, in a cooling cockpit, asking him which mission he intended to carry out. He thought of Rack, in a medical bay, admitting he had been given a quota he could not refuse. He thought of the pocket watch, heavy and familiar in his breast pocket, and of a father who had once cleaned a split lip on a back porch, and explained, patiently, that anger spent its whole reward up front, before you'd even seen the bill. Jack lowered his weapon, not fully, but enough. "No," he said, his voice steadier than he expected. "You're going to stand trial before the council, in front of every species you tried to convince that fairness was a weakness. You're going to answer for my father's death, and for Desmond Cho, and for Petra Lindquist, and for a Threll crew whose names you will learn and remember, in a chamber built for exactly that purpose. Killing you here would be easy, Dren. It would also be exactly what you want, because a dead warlord becomes a martyr for the next fool who believes cruelty is strength. A captured one has to sit in that chamber and listen, while the whole galaxy learns precisely what he actually is." Something shifted in Dren's expression, an ugly understanding dawning that the outcome he had been counting on, one way or another, was not the outcome he was going to get. And in that moment of understanding, his hand moved toward a hidden weapon at his side, faster than Jack had judged him capable of moving. Vel's shot took him in the shoulder a half-second before Dren's own weapon could clear its holster, and the warlord of the Vex Empire went down hard against his own bridge floor, alive, disarmed, and for the first time in his long and violent career, entirely at the mercy of people he had spent his whole life believing, incapable of showing him any. Sergeant Okonkwo moved quickly to secure him, binding the wound with brisk, professional efficiency even as he restrained him, a small, almost incidental mercy that seemed to strike Dren harder than any words could have. The remaining bridge crew, seeing their warlord taken and no order coming to retake him, slowly lowered their own weapons, uncertain what allegiance was even left to fight for. "Bridge secure," Alex reported into the comm, his voice carrying equal parts exhaustion and disbelief. "Admiral, we have him. Warlord Dren is alive and in custody." There was a long pause on the other end of the channel before Rios's voice returned, and when it did, it carried a rare and unguarded relief. "Copy that, Lieutenant Cole. Well done. All of you. Hold position and prepare for extraction. I am dispatching a larger security detachment to relieve you immediately." Jack looked down at the man responsible for his father's death, now slumped and silent against the deck of his own captured bridge, and felt, more than anything else, a kind of quiet exhaustion settle over the last 7 months of his life all at once, as though some great weight he had been carrying without fully noticing its size had finally been set down. "It's over," Vel said quietly, beside him. "Most of it," Jack said. "There's still a homeworld out there that doesn't know yet how close it came to needing this exact outcome." Word of Dren's capture spread through the Vex fleet within minutes, carried first by frantic, disorganized transmissions between his own captains and then, more decisively, by Kale himself, who had been commanding a detachment on the battle's outer edge, and who, upon confirming the news, made a decision that would later be studied by historians on a dozen worlds. "Stand down," Kale ordered his own ships, his voice carried across every open Vex channel. "Our warlord is taken. I will not throw away more lives defending a man who led us into a war we were already losing. Politically, the moment he chose murder over argument. Any captain who wishes to follow me may do so. I intend to negotiate this empire's surrender to the Council on terms that do not require every remaining Vex soldier to die defending one man's pride." Not every Vex captain followed him immediately, and scattered fighting continued for another hour before the last of the resistance finally broke. But by the time the Halden Reach fell quiet again, the invasion Dren had launched with such total confidence had ended not in the crushing victory he had promised his own officers, but in surrender, negotiated by the very advisor who had warned him, months before, that pride was not a strategy any empire could afford forever. The secondary coalition force, positioned near Van Space exactly as Rios had ordered, intercepted a small Vex detachment attempting to slip past the main battle toward the undefended homeworld, exactly as Rack had warned they might. It was a brief, one-sided engagement, and the Van homeworld, unaware for years afterward how close it had come to sharing the fate Dren had intended for it, remained safe. Dren was formally handed over to Council custody 3 days later, at Concord Station, in the same great domed chamber where Thomas Hale had once argued that fairness mattered more than fear. He said little during the brief proceeding, his earlier cold confidence entirely gone, replaced by the flat, exhausted silence of a man who had built his entire identity around being unstoppable, and had discovered, in a single afternoon, exactly how mistaken that belief had been. Elder Sora stood near the front of the chamber for the proceeding, exactly as she had stood beside Thomas the day he first argued the Halden Reaches case, and found Jack afterward in one of the station's quiet outer corridors, where he had gone to be alone for a few minutes with everything the last few days had asked of him. "Your father would not have wanted a parade for this," she said, settling beside him with the careful, unhurried movement of someone who had lived long enough to trust that most things worth saying could wait for the right moment to say them. "But I think he would have wanted you to know that I watched you decide not to become the thing you were fighting. That is a harder thing to do than winning the battle was, and I do not think it should pass without someone saying so plainly." "It didn't feel hard in the moment," Jack admitted. "It felt like the only thing that made any sense." "That," Sora said, "is usually how you can tell it was the right choice, and not merely the easy one." She was quiet for a moment, watching the distant stars through the corridor's viewport. "I sat with your father in his last minutes, Jack. I have thought, many times since, about what he might have wanted his son to become, in the aftermath of that. I believe I have my answer now." Kale, in the weeks that followed, was granted provisional authority to negotiate on behalf of the Vex Empire's civilian government, a government that had, in the chaos of Dren's fall, moved with surprising speed to distance itself from his ambitions and seek a lasting peace with the Council, rather than risk a longer, costlier war under new leadership cut from the same cloth. The eventual treaty, painstakingly negotiated over the following months, was not a perfect document, and satisfied no one completely, the way Elder Sora often said the best treaties rarely did. But it ended the war, restored the Halden Reach's shared protections, and included, at Kale's own quiet insistence, formal council recognition of the rights of conscripted soldiers like Rock, who had spent the war years fighting battles they had never personally chosen. News of the peace treaty reached Earth well before Jack's own ship did, and Dr. Voss's Steady Path movement, which had spent months arguing that the war might end in exactly this kind of costly stalemate, found itself in the strange position of having been proven wrong about the outcome, while still being taken seriously about the underlying question. Even Admiral Rios, in a public statement Sarah watched from her kitchen with quiet satisfaction, acknowledged that the peace movement's insistence on asking what victory should actually look like had shaped the terms of the final treaty as much as any battle had. Rock himself was granted asylum among the Threll, at Vel's personal sponsorship, and sent Jack a single short message some months later, translated carefully through official channels. "I did not choose my war. I am grateful to have finally chosen my peace. Tell your father, wherever such messages are actually delivered, that I heard him." Jack came home to Earth 6 weeks after the battle, aboard the Defiant, alongside Alex and Vel and Naomi, and the rest of the crew who had survived what history would eventually come to call the Battle of the Halden Reach. A little further down the same tarmac, Jack caught sight of Alex's father pulling his son into a rough, wordless hug of exactly the kind fathers who did not consider themselves talkers tended to give, and felt a small, private gladness that his best friend, at least, had gotten to come home to that. Alex caught Jack's eye over his father's shoulder and gave him a small, tired grin, the two of them sharing, without needing to say it aloud, the particular understanding of people who had walked through the same fire together and come out the other side. Sarah and Emily were waiting at the same shipyard where they had said goodbye, and this time, there were no careful, rehearsed words exchanged at all. Emily reached him first, half running across the tarmac despite years of careful teenage composure, and Jack caught her, and held on exactly as tightly as she held him. "You brought it back," she said, feeling the shape of the pocket watch through his jacket, even before he had a chance to take it out. "I told you I would," Jack said, and pulled it free, and pressed it into her open hands, the same worn silver case, scratched and familiar, that his father had once pressed into his own hands on the worst afternoon of his life. "It's yours now, same as Dad always meant it to be. Eventually. I just got to carry it through something first." Sarah held her son's face in both her hands, the same gesture she had used at every goodbye and every homecoming their family had ever shared, and did not try to find any grand words for the moment, because there were none that could have improved on the simple fact of him standing there, whole, in front of her. "Welcome home, Jack," she said. "I made it," Jack said. "Not always, but I made it." Before he allowed himself to rest, Jack asked Captain Reyes for one more day of leave before officially reporting for his next assignment, and used it to do something he had promised himself, somewhere over the long dark weeks of the journey home, that he would not put off. Petra Lindquist's son was younger than Jack had expected, barely 5 years old, and did not fully understand, in the careful way his grandmother explained it to him afterward, why the tall man in the dress uniform had come to see them, or why his mother was not coming home the way the other pilots were. Jack knelt down to the boy's level anyway, and told him, as simply and honestly as he knew how, that his mother had been one of the bravest people he had ever flown beside, and that she had died trying to reach a friend who needed her, which was, Jack said, about the finest thing anyone could ever be remembered for. "Vel kept this safe for you," Jack said, and handed Petra's mother a small data drive containing the photograph Vel had found among Petra's things after the battle at the outpost, along with a handful of recorded messages Petra had left for her son over the months of the campaign. Messages she had hoped, Jack understood now, she would never actually need to send. She talked about him more than she ever let on. "I thought you should have these properly, from someone who knew her, rather than through official channels." Petra's mother did not manage many words through her tears, but she held Jack's hand for a long moment before he left, and it felt, in its own quiet way, like exactly the kind of thing his father would have gone out of his way to do himself, had their positions been reversed. Desmond Cho's parents received him with a different kind of grief, quieter and more contained. His father, a retired shuttle mechanic who asked careful, practical questions about the battle that Jack understood were really a way of trying to picture, as clearly as he could bear to, the last minutes of his son's life. Jack answered every question honestly, told them of Desmond's small collection of holographic westerns and the crooked, easy grin he had worn even during the worst of the fighting, and told them, too, that Desmond had died shielding an outpost full of people he would never meet, buying time with the last thing he had to give. "He was 20 years old," Desmond's mother said quietly, not really a question. "He was," Jack said, "and he spent every one of those years, from what I could tell in the months I knew him, being exactly the kind of person worth being. I don't think there's a better way to measure a life than that, however short it turned out to be." They visited Thomas's memorial together the following morning, the simple stone marker in the green square outside the old United Nations building, now joined by a second, smaller plaque the council itself had commissioned in the months since the battle. Its inscription translated into a dozen different languages, one for every species that had eventually stood beside Earth in the war his death had set in motion. Jack read the inscription slowly, though he already knew, better than almost anyone alive, the words it had been drawn from. "Patience outlasts anger, every single time. Let no death become only a wound to avenge." "They renamed the Reach's protected status after him," Emily said quietly, standing beside her brother. "Elder Sora told me, in a message last week, they're calling it the Hail Accord, officially, in every council record from now on." Vel had come to Earth with them for the memorial, at Jack's own invitation, and stood a respectful distance back from the family during the visit, though Jack waved him closer once the initial quiet had passed. "My grandmother served through most of the Long War," Vel said, when Jack asked what she had made of the news of peace. "She told me, when I informed her the treaty was signed, that she had stopped believing, many years ago, that she would live to see her own people's wars end in anything other than exhaustion rather than genuine agreement. She asked me to tell you, if I ever had the chance, that your father's name is spoken with real gratitude in Threll households now, not merely official respect." "Tell her I said thank you," Jack said, "for everything her generation went through, so that mine could end up with something better to build on." "He would have hated the attention," Sarah said, with the ghost of a fond, tired smile. "He always said the work should matter more than the man doing it." "Maybe," Jack said, "but I think he'd have been glad the work outlasted him, either way. That was always the actual point, wasn't it? Not that he got remembered. That the fairness he was fighting for actually stuck around after he couldn't fight for it anymore." He stood there a while longer, between his mother and his sister, in the same green square where he had once promised an entire grieving world that Earth would be patient without standing still, and found that the promise, 7 months and 1 war later, had somehow managed to hold. Somewhere far above them, past the edge of the sky, the Halden Reach's scattered asteroid fields continued their slow, ancient drift, indifferent as always to the wars fought over them, while a galaxy that had once dismissed humanity as young and small and unimportant, now carried, in a dozen languages and a dozen official records, the final words of a man who had simply refused to believe that fairness and strength were ever truly opposites. Jack closed his hand loosely around the place in his jacket where the watch used to sit, out of habit more than need, and found, for the first time in longer than he could clearly remember, that his hand came away steady and empty and at peace.